Hey guys, tonight we're cracking open one of the most misunderstood chapters of Viking life, marriage. Now if you're imagining wind-blown romance on the fjords, candlelit oaths whispered under a rune-carved archway, and rugged Viking husbands sweeping fierce flaxen-haired brides off their feet, no, let's reel that in. Viking marriage was brutal, transactional, and built less on love and more on livestock. You probably won't survive this one, emotionally or historically. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and the current time in the comments. I want to know who else is staying up way too late with this weird obsession. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. South, you're a Viking. You've survived your first winter without freezing to death, your first raid without losing any limbs, and now your parents, because yes, they still pull the strings, are arranging your marriage. Not because you're in love. That concept exists, but it's background noise at best. No, they're looking to solidify a bloodline, merge some land, or maybe ensure that your future children have just enough noble blood to avoid getting sacrificed in a fertility ritual. Love is optional. A good dowry, not so much. Here's how it typically works. Your family finds another family with similar standing. Farmers, landowners, minor nobles if you're lucky. Then they meet to discuss the terms. This is the Motganga, the negotiation. It involves ale, loud voices and a lot of number crunching. You're not there, by the way. If you're the bride, you're probably off learning to weave or watching goats. If you're the groom, you're busy sharpening something. Either way, this isn't about you, this is business. The bride price, or munda, is a big deal. It's essentially what your family pays the bride's family for her hand. But hang on, this isn't buying a person exactly. It's more like sealing a pact. The bride's family gives a dowry too, often in livestock, textiles or servants. So yeah, it's a full-blown economic merger. Sometimes there's a clause in the deal saying if the husband mistreats the wife, her family gets the munda back. Call it early Norse prenup energy. And while we're here, let's talk about bloodlines. Viking families are obsessed with lineage. They can recite 10 generations back without blinking, mostly because it helps prove why they're better than you. Your family needs to marry you into someone with decent ancestry. Marrying down brings shame. Marrying up? That's high-stakes diplomacy. Sometimes people even fake lineage to get ahead. Claiming to be descended from Odin was a surprisingly common flex. And if you were born outside of marriage, good luck. Even if your dad was a chieftain, you'd always be that bastard son from the barley field in everyone's eyes. Now here's a quirky little twist. Some families literally loaned brides. Not in a grotesque, obvious way, but during harsh winters or famine years, daughters might be temporarily married off, with the hope of better food supplies or social leverage. If things didn't work out, maybe she came home with a few goats, a necklace, and a very confusing story. Love? Again, not really on the agenda. Sustainability was. But even the most transactional union still needed an official ceremony. No rings, no white dresses. Vikings didn't do Pinterest weddings, but they did throw epic parties. Feasting, drinking, gift-giving. An entire village might get involved. The bride often wore a blue dress and ornate headpieces, and there was usually a symbolic sword passed from father to groom. Not to use, just tradition. Now, here's where it gets a little stomach-turning. To finalise the marriage, the couple had to consummate it. That part, often done while relatives waited just outside. Sometimes someone literally stood guard. In a few Icelandic sagas, it's hinted that the bedding was publicly verified, if not witnessed outright. Imagine your weird uncle standing outside the tent with a drinking horn and saying, "We're all rooting for you." Welcome to intimacy, Viking style. And speaking of saga accounts, some scholars argue that our entire understanding of Viking marriage is skewed by these epic stories. Written centuries later, often by Christian monks, they reflect a hybrid view of Norse customs and later European morality. So, there's an open debate. Were Viking marriages always this cold and calculated, or are we reading too much into the politics and not enough into private lives? There might have been real love stories. We just don't get to hear about them because love doesn't drive inheritance disputes or inspire clan feuds. Betrayals do. Also debated? The age of consent. Not legally defined, of course, but girls could be married off as young as 12. boys, usually older, because they needed to prove they could support a household, i.e. had enough cows or enough stolen treasure. So yeah, that adds an uncomfortable layer. By our standards, it's deeply problematic, but for them, it was survival logic. One strange detail from archaeological digs: some brides were buried with combs, tweezers and makeup, things meant to reflect beauty, femininity and social rank. This suggests that, whatever the brutality of the marriage system, there was also a performative grace expected of wives. Appearances mattered, even after death. And then there's the matchmaking itself, sometimes done with help from a vulva, a kind of Viking witch seer. She might bless the match or curse it, depending on which side gave better offerings. If you didn't bribe her with silver or sacrifice a goat, she might predict doom, famine, or a husband who snores. No pressure. So, to recap, Viking. Marriage is a structured transaction backed by property, fertility, family honour and superstition. It's as much about clan politics as it is about two people sharing a bed. And if you think you get a say in your own fate, well, maybe if you're lucky. But most likely you'll do what your family tells you and hope the person you're bound to doesn't snore, cheat or try to sacrifice you during a thunderstorm. And with that charming setup, you're now officially married in the Viking world. Congratulations. Things only get messier from here. Now that you're married, congrats again by the way, truly heartwarming. Let's talk about the real currency of this whole affair, the bride price. Because nothing says eternal devotion like livestock negotiations and silver ingots being passed across a mead-soaked table. The munda, as the Vikings called it, wasn't just a fee. It was a public statement of a man's worth. If you're the groom, paying too little makes you look poor or worse, dishonourable. Pay too much, and people whisper that you're compensating for something else. Either way, everyone's watching, and they're not shy about judgment. So here's how it plays out. Two families meet, usually in someone's longhouse, crowded with fur-cloaked elders, nose-picking kids, and a fire spitting smoke into everyone's eyes. The groom's father brings out the offer. This might include silver coins, a few cows, a sword with some fancy engravings, and maybe land rights if things are getting serious. The bride's family looks unimpressed. They sip their ale slowly. They glance at each other, raise eyebrows, and someone casually mentions that the family down the fjord offered 3 times as much for their cousin last year. It's a performance. Negotiations in Viking society are half trade deal, half flex. Eventually the bride price is agreed upon, but don't confuse this with a woman being bought. That's too simple, and too modern a lens. Think of the bride price as a pledge. It says, I can support your daughter, I can provide for her, and I'm not some bottom-tier farmer whose sheep keep dying of mysterious swamp rot. It's about social capital. If the groom mistreats the bride, her family could demand that the munda be returned, kind of like an early warning system for bad husbands. Also on the table, the hymen fylgja, a kind of starter pack for the bride when she moves into her husband's household. This could include a chest of linen, tools, jewellery, and even servants. Some girls brought enough land and resources with them to drastically raise their new family's standing. It wasn't just marriage, it was a merger, and it could get absurdly complicated. In high-status families, deals were sometimes brokered over several years, with conditions layered like a Viking onion. You can marry my daughter if your cousin marries my niece, and only if your brother hands over that pasture near the river we both claim but refuse to talk about. The Norse had no patience for small talk, but they loved an interlocking alliance. Marriage was how chieftains became kings, and how kings got assassinated when the alliances backfired. You can picture the tension. A longhouse full of people with knives, drunk on honey mead, arguing over who gets to inherit a pair of oxen and a strip of bogland. It's less romantic and more like a legal drama with axes. Now here's a weird little twist. In some sagas, there are mentions of gifts given directly from the groom to the bride, called the morning gift. Think of it like a Viking honeymoon gesture. After the wedding night, which, again, was sometimes way too public, the groom would give the bride a personal gift. Land, treasure, or sometimes a piece of inherited family jewellery. This part did have a touch of sweetness, though it was still very strategic. The bride now had a bit of wealth that legally belonged to her, not her husband, her. That tiny spark of autonomy. It mattered. In fact, Viking women had more legal power than a lot of their medieval counterparts elsewhere. A wife could sue for divorce, own property, and reclaim her dowry if things went south. But more on that when we get to breakups. Right now, you're still married, and people are still gossiping about how your wedding feast was shorter than your cousin's. Back to bride prices. The size and structure of these deals also reflected the massive social range within Viking culture. We always think of bearded warriors on longboats, but most people were farmers. Simple folks with muddy boots and goats that kept escaping. For them, marriage might involve a single cow and a bundle of wool, but for the rich, the sky was the limit. Gold arm rings, rare horses, foreign slaves, imported silk. Some Icelandic marriages involved assets so huge they required witnesses and legal scribes to sort out who owned what. It was less about the couple and more about ensuring no one got cheated 2 generations down the line. And yes, sometimes this all happened without the bride even knowing. In sagas, you'll find cases where young women are essentially bartered away while out fetching water or weaving inside. They return to the hearth only to find out they've been promised to some guy who smells like fish and already has 3 kids. That's the brutal part. Consent wasn't always a requirement, though in more progressive pockets, like certain Icelandic settlements, girls could voice an objection. If anyone listened, that is. Scholars debate how common female autonomy really was. Some argue it's overstated, a modern projection onto a patriarchal society. Others point to legal texts and grave goods as evidence that Norse women weren't entirely powerless. For example, some burial mounds contain keys, literal household keys, suggesting authority within the home. But was that real power, or just symbolic? Still being debated. Meanwhile, here's a fun fringe fact. There's evidence that some Viking brides had tattoos. Not the full-sleeve dragons you're picturing, more likely delicate patterns, maybe magical runes. Arabic accounts described Norse women with inked hands and necks. Whether these tattoos were status symbols, protective charms, or just ancient body art, we don't fully know. But it adds a whole new flavour to your mental image of a Viking bride. And speaking of appearances, Vikings took grooming seriously. Yes, even during marriage negotiations. A greasy-haired suitor with unkempt nails might lose a deal no matter how fat his herd was. Combs, tweezers, and even ear spoons have been found in burial sites. So before you met your future in-laws, you better clean up. No one wants to tie their daughter to a man who can't be bothered to scrub behind his ears. In short, the bride price wasn't just about money, it was about message. It told the community, this marriage is valid. This union is recognised. These families are now interlinked, so don't mess with them unless you want a very messy feud. Love might have followed later, or not. What mattered was that everything was seen, negotiated and signed, verbally or ritually, in front of a crowd. And with that, the social contract was sealed. You weren't just married, you were tied, knotted and politically entangled with another bloodline for better or worse. Mostly worse, if the goats died. So let's talk about age. Not your age now, though if you're still awake, I'm guessing it's somewhere between way too late and I've already made poor life choices, but the ages of Viking couples on their wedding days. Because here's where it starts getting really uncomfortable. You, in this scenario, might be a 12-year-old girl being handed off to a grizzled 30-year-old man with battle scars and at least one story involving berserkers, blood, and a cursed drinking horn. It wasn't technically creepy in Viking terms, it was just the norm. In many parts of the Viking world, girls could be married off as soon as they hit puberty. That meant somewhere between 12 and 14 was fair game for a betrothal. And it wasn't necessarily because Vikings were obsessed with youth. It was about fertility. A young wife meant more childbearing years ahead. And in a world where half your kids might not survive their 5th birthday, quantity was everything. More children meant more farmhands, more warriors, and a better chance of your bloodline making it through the next generation of plagues, wars, and questionable fishing expeditions. Boys, on the other hand, typically married later. Not because they were waiting for true love, but because they had to prove themselves. Viking masculinity was a performance, one that involved raiding, farming, swordsmanship, and building enough wealth to make an appealing offer. So a first-time groom might be in his mid to late 20s, sometimes older. That created some pretty significant age gaps. A 13-year-old girl married to a 35-year-old man. Not rare, not illegal, just expected. Now, this wasn't always as exploitative as it sounds. In some cases, these marriages started with long engagements, and the actual union wasn't consummated until the bride was older. At least that's what some scholars suggest. But the truth is, we don't know how often that happened. Records are sparse, and sagas. They're more interested in revenge plots than ethical discussions around marital age gaps. So it remains an open debate. Were younger brides protected until maturity, or was that just a convenient gloss added by later Christian writers trying to make the old stories sound less icky? Meanwhile, for the young bride, her life changed overnight. One day she's spinning wool, maybe sneaking berries from the kitchen storage. The next she's head of a household, expected to manage servants, brew ale, and host gatherings without burning the meat stew or offending her husband's terrifying mother. It was a harsh onboarding process, and there was no HR department. And don't think older husbands were always gentle mentors. Some were decent, others were distant, cold, or downright violent. Domestic abuse, while not widely documented in Viking law, was likely common. There were few consequences, and societal pressure leaned toward keeping the marriage intact, especially when dowries and land were involved. A woman's family could step in if things got really bad, but by then it might have already cost her physically or emotionally. Now here's a fringy, underexplored detail: the existence of childless marriages. While fertility was prized, not every couple had children. Some sagas mention couples who remained childless for years, and their social standing suffered as a result. In fact, the pressure to produce an heir was so intense that barren wives could be divorced, even if the issue was the husband's fertility, not that anyone was checking. And if you were a teenage bride who failed to get pregnant quickly, cue the whispering. But not all young brides were powerless. Some, especially those from wealthy or noble families, wielded surprising influence. Their age didn't always equate to fragility. A girl who came from a strong bloodline might be respected simply because of her connections. She might even have advisors, older women, family members or servants, who coached her through the social labyrinth of Viking domestic life. Think of them as the Norse equivalent of a mentorship program, but with more mead and fewer spreadsheets. Still, there's no getting around it. The pressure was enormous. You were expected to mature overnight. You had to understand farm accounting, household diplomacy, conflict resolution, and livestock management, all while maybe still missing your childhood dog. And in some cases, you were expected to give birth within a year. No pain relief, no modern medicine, just you, a smoky longhouse, and a midwife who may or may not believe in trolls. Let's not forget the ceremonial expectations either. At these young ages, you'd still have to participate in the rituals surrounding the marriage, including the wedding feast, which could stretch for days, and the dreaded public bedding custom. In certain regions, this involved people literally walking the couple to their marital bed, where they were supposed to consummate the marriage, while family members sang, prayed, or, worst of all, cheered from outside. In some Icelandic accounts, the bride and groom had to sleep on a specially prepared bed made of straw, with symbolic weapons placed nearby. An axe for him, a spindle for her. No pressure. One popular myth is that Viking marriages were all about the husband dominating the wife, but it's not that simple. Viking society, though patriarchal, had elements of mutual duty built into the marriage structure. A husband was expected to provide not just materially but emotionally, offering protection, companionship, and yes, sexual satisfaction. If a wife was unhappy and the marriage failed, it could reflect poorly on him. And in the case of certain age gap pairings, younger wives could, over time, grow into positions of substantial authority, even over older husbands, especially if the man died, which, let's face it, happened a lot. The saga literature is sprinkled with stories of clever, sharp-tongued women who navigated these uneven matches like pros. They used wit, family alliances, and sheer nerve to hold their own. A classic example is Halgudr from Njal's saga, who, despite her troubled marriage, manipulates family politics with lethal precision. She's not likeable, but she is undeniably powerful. Modern scholars love debating these stories. Were they exaggerations, literary devices, or genuine reflections of female agency in a brutal system? The jury's still out, and every new grave or runestone only adds more layers. For instance, a burial site in Norway once thought to be a high-ranking male warrior turned out, through DNA analysis, to be a woman. A warrior woman, possibly a wife, possibly unmarried. It stirred up all kinds of questions about gender roles, power, and how much we've misunderstood Viking society based on assumptions. So there you are, married young, adjusting fast and juggling both social survival and personal dignity. You're expected to bear children, keep the household running, and make your grizzled new husband look good at feasts. The odds are stacked against you, but if you're clever, politically savvy, and possibly blessed by Freya herself, you might just make it work. Or more likely, you'll live through a few harsh winters, endure a feud or two, maybe get widowed by a poorly timed sea raid, and find yourself negotiating your next marriage. This time, with a few more tricks up your sleeve. So, the vows have been exchanged, the goats have been bartered, and you've just survived a multi-day feast fueled by mead, roast lamb, and more passive-aggressive toast than any family gathering should ever include. But now comes the part you've probably been dreading, your Viking wedding night. And no, you're not getting privacy. In fact, the wedding night was less a romantic encounter and more a public performance, half sacred rite, half awkward community event, with a side of heavy breathing and ceremonial chanting. Because nothing says lifelong commitment like consummating your marriage while your drunk uncle waits outside to confirm the deed is done. Let's set the scene. It's dusk. The longhouse is buzzing from the wedding feast. People are still drinking, children are falling asleep on benches, and someone's probably wrestling a goat in the corner. You and your brand new spouse are guided, yes, guided toward the bridal bed. Depending on the region and century, the bedding might happen in a special alcove in the family's longhouse, or in a separate structure built just for the occasion. Either way, you're not sneaking off unnoticed. Everyone expects to see the two of you walk hand in hand into that sacred space. If you look too nervous, the crowd gets restless, too eager. Expect some crude jokes about fertility. Now here's the kicker. Sometimes this whole process was blessed by elders, and I don't mean metaphorical blessings. I mean actual chanting, symbolic placing of weapons in the bedding, and even the passing of fertility tokens. In some regions, it was common to place the groom's sword or axe under the bed, or even directly between the couple, to cut away bad luck and ensure a fruitful union. For the bride, symbols of domesticity like keys, a spindle, or even bread might be included. Because yes, nothing says sensual ambience like your future in-laws waving around a ceremonial loaf of rye. And in more than a few accounts, particularly in later Christian-influenced regions, there are mentions of witnesses, as in people who would literally stand guard outside the room or tent to make sure the marriage was properly consummated. Some sagas go a step further, hinting that witnesses might enter the room afterward to inspect the sheets. If there was blood, great, proof of virginity, a successful deflowering, and cue the toasts. If not, well, get ready for rumours, a lot of them. Privacy, never heard of her. Now, not all regions followed this exact ritual. In parts of Scandinavia, particularly among wealthier or more rural families, the bedding ceremony could be more symbolic than literal. The couple might share a ceremonial bed in front of witnesses, but wait until everyone had passed out from drinking before, actually getting down to business. But again, this is debated. Scholars can't agree on how universal these practices were. Some argue that saga accounts exaggerate the public aspect for dramatic effect. Others say the emphasis on community, confirmation of the marriage's validity made these rituals crucial and very real. Here's a quirky little fact. In some Norse communities, there was a belief that if the marriage wasn't consummated, it wasn't fully binding. This means that if, for whatever reason, you couldn't or wouldn't sleep with your new spouse that first night, the union could be challenged. That's right. Your entire social and economic future might hinge on whether or not you were able to seal the deal, with half your neighbours waiting for confirmation. No pressure. So how did it go? That's tough to say. If you're lucky, your new spouse is only twice your age, mostly sober, and not particularly violent. Maybe they even try to be kind. Maybe they understand how terrifying this moment is for you, especially if you're a young bride who's just been paraded in front of half the village and handed over like a very expensive prize goat. But then again, maybe not. Viking attitudes toward consent were uneven at best. A man had marital rights over his wife, and those rights were socially and legally reinforced. That doesn't mean all Viking marriages were abusive, but it does mean that abuse, if it happened, was rarely punished. Interestingly, some sagas depict tender moments, couples who seem to enjoy each other's company, husbands who consult their wives before decisions, even playful teasing. But these moments are rare and always entangled in power. After all, this is a society built on hierarchy. Men above women, warriors above farmers, elders above youth. And marriage is a performance of those layers. Once the bedding ceremony was complete, the couple would emerge to cheers, gifts, and sometimes more food. The bride might be formally introduced to her new household the next morning, receiving keys to the storerooms, instructions from the mother-in-law, and maybe a crash course in not offending the cook. If the groom had servants, or slaves, the dynamic could get even weirder. The new bride was now expected to oversee them, even if she'd never managed more than a goat before. And let's not forget the clan politics, because consummation didn't just bond two people, it bonded two families. If, gods forbid, something went wrong, if the bride resisted, if the groom got too drunk, or if someone in the extended family objected to the union, it could spark a feud. Not a squabble, a feud. Blood might be spilled, alliances shattered, and the couple themselves, trapped in the middle, expected to smile politely while their uncles threaten each other over breakfast. And in some cases, consummation wasn't even the end. It was the beginning of a series of fertility rituals. Some families believed that the first year of marriage was spiritually fragile, so they'd place fertility charms around the bed, bury symbolic objects under the threshold, or have elders bless the couple monthly to ensure that pregnancy came soon and safely, because in Viking society a marriage without children was like a boat without sails, pretty useless unless you were planning on sinking. Another fun fact, in some regions new brides were expected to perform household duties immediately after the wedding. No honeymoon, no adjustment period. You might wake up the next morning expected to bake bread, organise storage pots, or oversee the butchering of a pig. If you messed up, people would talk. If you excelled, congratulations, you've just won the respect of a longhouse full of strangers. Welcome to adulthood. And what about your feelings? Irrelevant. Love was a bonus, not a requirement. Some couples grew fond of each other over time. Others remained distant. A few became bitter enemies trapped in a socially sanctioned alliance. You hoped for the first, tolerated the second, and quietly prepared for the third. It was all about appearances, function over feeling. Keep the fires stoked, the children healthy, and the gossip under control. So, you've survived the wedding night. You've passed the weird community inspection, dodged any early scandals, and now you're officially settled into the long, exhausting rhythm of Viking marriage. Not for the faint of heart. But hey, you didn't get cursed, no one started a blood feud at the feast, and your new spouse didn't snore loud enough to wake the ancestors. All in all, a pretty solid start. Okay, now that you've survived your Viking wedding, and the uncomfortable public aspects of the bedding ritual, you might think the hardest part is over. But here's the twist. Viking wives weren't just decorative trophies perched at the edge of the hearth. No, now the real work begins. And depending on your background, your status, and your overall appetite for chaos, you might just become one of the most powerful people in the Longhouse. Because while Viking society was dominated by men, women, especially wives, held surprising, sometimes shocking degrees of control. Especially if you were the right kind of woman, especially if you knew how to wield it like a sword. Let's start with the basics. Once you're married, your husband might spend a lot of time, well, not home. Raiding season is real. Trade voyages can last for months, sometimes years. And war? There's always a cousin to avenge or a neighbouring village to punish for suspiciously letting their cows graze too close to the border. Which means that while your husband is off playing Pirate King, you are the one holding it all together. The farm, the household, the food stores, the slaves if you have them, the livestock, the kids, the accounts, the brewing, the textile production, and all the rumours swirling around your community that could either elevate your family's reputation or destroy it. You carry the keys, literally. The keys to the pantry, to the grain stores, to the chests of silver and dowry goods. And if you're a wealthy wife, that jangling keyring clipped to your belt is practically a badge of authority. You decide who gets fed, who gets punished, what gets traded, and whether your sister-in-law's fourth accidental trip into your kitchen warrants a polite smile or an epic shaming at the next feast. No wonder those keys show up in Viking women's graves. They were status symbols as much as any sword or battle axe. But what if you're more than just a housekeeper with a killer side eye? What if you're a shield maiden? Ah yes, the most debated and romanticised figure in Viking lore. There's ongoing scholarly debate about whether shield maidens, women who fought in battle, were common, rare, or mostly mythical. Some point to burial sites with women interred alongside weapons and armour. Others say the sagas overstate it, but regardless of how often it happened, the very idea of the fighting wife loomed large in Norse imagination. Imagine being one of them, a woman who trained with a sword, possibly joined a raid, and came back with her own share of loot. It didn't necessarily exempt you from housework, by the way. You could still be expected to tend sheep and host visiting in-laws, but it gave you a kind of legendary aura. People listened when you spoke, and if your husband hit you, that was the kind of mistake people didn't repeat. Even if the evidence for actual shield maidens is still being debated, the fact that they were believed in says something powerful about Viking expectations for women, not just to endure, but to fight when needed. And let's talk about fighting in the metaphorical sense too. Because Viking wives had to be socially strategic. If you weren't born a warrior, you could still dominate the political battlefield. Hosting a feast. You had to know which neighbours to seat next to each other to avoid a dagger under the table. Planning a trade. You might be the one smoothing over egos while your husband sulks in the corner about some ancient insult no one remembers. Raising sons. You're shaping future warriors. Managing daughters. You're planning the next round of alliances through marriage. Viking women had influence because everyone was watching them work, and the smart ones leaned into it. One surprising freedom Viking wives had was the right to divorce. More on that in a later chapter, but yes, it existed. If your husband mistreated you, humiliated you, or failed to provide, you could walk away. Sometimes literally carrying your keys and whatever portion of the dowry was legally yours. That was rare in the medieval world, and it made Viking marriage less of a life sentence and more of a social contract with escape clauses. Of course, that power wasn't universal. If you were a thrall, a slave or servant woman married, or claimed by your master, your autonomy was basically non-existent. Your duties were harsher, your rights fewer, and your life frankly disposable. Viking society was brutally stratified. The elite women got to play queen of the hearth, the lowborn had to scrape by, hoping they didn't get traded away or beaten when the firewood ran out. And that harsh divide kept many women in constant negotiation with their place in the world. Social climbing, through marriage or childbearing, was sometimes the only route to freedom. Back in your longhouse you might be busy weaving. Now don't roll your eyes. Weaving wasn't just domestic fluff. It was economics, military logistics, and fashion all rolled into one. Cloth was wealth, clothing was status, and a wife who could produce fine, tightly woven textiles was securing her family's reputation, especially if the patterns had hidden runes or clan symbols woven in. Viking textiles were complex, beautiful, and labour-intensive. You weren't just keeping the kids in cloaks, you were sending political messages with your loom. Here's a strange but true little detail. Some Viking wives brewed their own ale or mead, and brewing in many cases wasn't just about drinking. It was part of religious ceremonies, gift exchanges, and medical treatments. If your brew was bad, you might be laughed out of a gathering. If it was really bad, people would whisper that you were cursed. But if it was good, oh, now we're talking. Your mead could be requested at weddings, offered at sacrifices, even traded for silver. Not bad for what started as a kitchen hobby. And don't forget storytelling. Viking wives were often the keepers of oral traditions. Sagas, genealogies, family curses, epic tales. You might sit by the hearth with children on your lap, retelling stories that preserved not just your history but your authority. Because knowledge, especially in an oral culture, is power. If you knew the old tales, if you could quote the gods, if you remembered which ancestor betrayed whom and why, that made you indispensable, even dangerous. And maybe, just maybe, you practiced a little magic. Women were often associated with Seder, a form of Norse sorcery involving prophecy, spirit travel, and ritual. Practitioners weren't always respected. Sometimes they were feared or accused of meddling with fate, but a wife with a touch of cedar could scare off enemies, bless a harvest, or read omens in the smoke of the hearth fire. It wasn't always safe, but it was potent. So yeah, Viking marriage may have started with livestock exchanges and creepy public bedding ceremonies, but once you settled into your role as a wife, you weren't just surviving, you were commanding a household, steering a family, and possibly whispering to the gods when no one else was listening. It was hard, dangerous, and endlessly exhausting, but in the right hands it could also be powerful. And now that you've taken on that mantle, keys on your belt, stories in your head, maybe a little something brewing in the cauldron, you're ready for what comes next. Because while your marriage might have started as a deal struck over drinks, your place in this world is anything but passive. Now, let's say your marriage has officially settled into its rhythm. You've got the household under control, you've learned to manage your husband's moods, and your mead is the kind of brew that gets you compliments at feasts from people who barely know your name. But if you're under the illusion that this is some monogamous husband and wife storybook setup, you know, the type where he brings you fjord flowers and never so much as glances at another woman, well, I hate to break it to you, but Viking fidelity wasn't exactly the norm. Welcome to the glorious mess that is concubinage and sea mistresses, a tale of long voyages, loophole lovers, and very flexible definitions of faithful. So let's be honest, Viking men travelled a lot, raiding, trading, wandering, or just showing off how far they could row without dying. These trips lasted for months, even years, and while some husbands pined faithfully for their wives back home, many didn't. Enter the frilla. That's the Old Norse word for a concubine. Not quite a wife, but not exactly a fling either. More like a part-time romantic partner who might live in your house, bear your children, and still rank below your official spouse on every social ladder. You, the wife, probably weren't thrilled about this. But unless your husband violated some specific agreements, like spending too much on the concubine, or favouring her children over yours, there wasn't much you could do. Concubinage wasn't illegal. In fact, it was culturally accepted in many Viking communities, especially among the elite. Wealthy men could have one or more frilla without causing scandal, as long as they kept things tidy and the main wife stayed the top lady in charge. Think of it as unofficial polygamy, but with stricter rules about inheritance and dinner seating. The children of these arrangements could complicate things. Sons of concubines were often considered legitimate if the father acknowledged them. That meant more heirs to divide land between, more rivalries to foster, and more whispered insults at family gatherings. Daughters, depending on who their mother was, might be married off like political pawns or quietly forgotten. And that's if the wife allowed them anywhere near her own children at all. In some households the frilla lived separately, in others she might work as a servant. Occasionally she was treated more like a second wife. The arrangements varied wildly, and your comfort with it depended on your own status. If you came from a powerful family and your dowry was thick with silver and land, you might be able to lay down the law: one wife, no mistresses, or else. But if you were from a smaller family, married into power, and trying to hold your place, you smiled through your teeth while your husband named the new girl after a Valkyrie and built her a second bed near the stables. Now here's a fun and weird fringe detail. Some Viking men took concubines abroad. Like, literally. They'd sail off on a raid, sack a monastery, pick up a slave girl along the way, and decide to keep her. In the worst cases, these women were dragged back to Scandinavia as spoils of war. In the better, but still morally grim, cases, they were integrated into Viking households as concubines or servants. And if the man decided to settle in foreign lands, which many Vikings did, you could end up with a whole second family in Dublin, or York, or some random coastal village in what is now Ukraine. This gets even messier when you realise that Vikings weren't just raiders, they were settlers. A lot of Norsemen stayed in the places they raided, married local women, and raised families, which means if you're the wife back home waiting by the hearth with your perfect grain inventory and adorable children, you might be completely unaware that your husband is playing happy families across the sea. The Norse had no phones, no letters, and no GPS. All you'd get is a messenger once a year, maybe. He could be dead. He could be ruling a village in Normandy. You'd never know. So, what did you do if your husband vanished for too long? There were rules. Depending on the region, you might be able to remarry after 3 years of absence, assuming he was presumed dead. But if he came back after 5 years with a new wife and a batch of war-born toddlers, now it's your problem, and his second wife's too. And no, she doesn't automatically lose her rights. If the local thing laws, that's what Viking legal codes were called, accepted her as a concubine or spouse in his settlement, the courts might see her kids as half-heirs to your estate. Cue the intercontinental family drama, and let's not pretend Viking women didn't also stray. Affairs were dangerous, sometimes deadly, but not unheard of, wives left behind for years might take lovers discreetly. In some sagas, women fall for neighbouring warriors, clever farmhands, or even family enemies. If caught, the consequences could be severe. A jealous husband might kill the lover, beat the wife, or divorce her outright. But occasionally wives got away with it, especially if they held power, came from noble lines, or if their husband's own behaviour was scandalous enough to cancel out the affair. There's an especially juicy saga where a high-status woman cheats on her emotionally distant husband and justifies it by claiming the gods had approved. Did they? Probably not, but it's a bold strategy, and it hints at how the divine was sometimes used as a loophole for personal freedom or personal chaos. Scholars debate how common these double lives really were. The sagas, of course, are dramatic and full of poetic license. Some argue that concubinage was rare among average farmers, who could barely feed one wife, let alone two. Others think it was more prevalent than the records show, just not always officially documented. Because really, Who Wants to Chisel also had a secret girlfriend, in England, into a runestone. Here's another odd little historical note. In some cases, concubines and wives got along. There are hints in the records of blended Viking households where the friller managed household duties alongside the wife. Maybe it was awkward, maybe it was efficient, maybe they teamed up to roll their eyes every time the man in their lives made another dumb decision involving a stolen horse and a rival chieftain. It's all possible. And what about religion? Before Christianity took over, Norse belief systems didn't explicitly condemn multiple partners. Freya, god of fertility, had a human lover and wasn't judged for it. Loki, the shape-shifting chaos god, had a, let's call it, flexible love life. The divine didn't demand monogamy, it demanded balance, loyalty to clan, and oaths kept. So as long as you weren't breaking a vow or destabilising the household, having a few lovers on the side wasn't a major spiritual offence. But once Christianity began to creep into Scandinavia, things shifted. Missionaries started preaching about one man, one woman, and eternal sin for everyone else. Suddenly mistresses weren't just socially awkward, they were morally corrupt. And while it took a while for those ideas to fully settle in, the growing pressure eventually reshaped Viking marriage customs in a big way. Fidelity became idealised, even if not always practised. So where does that leave you, Viking wife extraordinaire? You're running the household, managing your children, possibly supervising the concubine who makes better porridge than you, and trying not to stab your husband every time he casually mentions the girl he met while trading in Novgorod. It's not easy, it's not fair, but it's the world you live in. And if you're clever, you might just find ways to use it all to your advantage. Because in the Viking world, even love triangles were less about passion and more about power. Now that you've fully stepped into your role as a Viking wife, keys jangling at your waist, stew bubbling over the hearth, and a household constantly teetering between organised chaos and full-on feasting, you're probably wondering what your actual day-to-day duties look like. And spoiler, it's not lounging around in a wool cloak waiting for your sea-salted husband to show up with gifts from a distant raid. No, your life is a rotating schedule of brewing, bookkeeping, child-rearing, stitching, social manoeuvring, and the occasional animal birthing emergency. In Viking society, the wife didn't just keep the home, she was the home's operating system. Let's start with the beating heart of the longhouse: food. Your job is to make sure no one dies of starvation, bad meat, or an accidental mushroom misidentification. You're in charge of stores, barley, dried fish, salted meats, cabbages that somehow smell like wet dog, and that special batch of mead aging quietly in the corner. During the long winters, when the sun rises for maybe an hour and everyone gets weirdly philosophical, it's your job to keep the family fed, sane, and not trying to cook the cat. And it's not just daily meals. Viking women also handled feasts, which were major social events and subtle battlegrounds of reputation. You need to seat guests in the correct pecking order: high-status warriors near the fire, gossiping aunties near the mead barrels, and make sure everyone leaves full, impressed, and not planning a feud over being offered a smaller leg of mutton than their rival. Hosting well could boost your family's standing. Hosting poorly? Now people whisper about how your salted lamb tasted like disappointment and mildew, but your responsibilities don't end with food. You're also the unofficial CFO of the household. While your husband may trade abroad or collect loot, you're tracking inventories, managing the slaves or servants, allocating resources, and sometimes even settling disputes among the household. Did Thora borrow your weaving spindle without asking again? Did someone drink the last of the mead and blame it on the dog? Guess who has to mediate and keep the peace? That's right, you. And let's talk textile production, because if you're not weaving, you're probably asleep. Viking wives spent hours upon hours spinning yarn, dyeing cloth, and weaving fabric, all by hand. It wasn't just about making clothes. Textiles were currency. They could be traded, gifted, used to pay debts, and offered during marriages or funerals. Your loom isn't some cosy domestic tool. It's a literal engine of wealth. And if your weaving is sloppy, that's a direct hit to your status. No pressure, of course. You also make sure the family's clothes are weather appropriate, which, considering Scandinavia's climate, basically means thick, thicker, and are you wearing 2 capes yet? Children need tunics. Your husband needs battle-ready leggings. And everyone needs mittens that don't fall apart the second it snows sideways, which is always. Meanwhile, your children are either clinging to your skirt, being scolded by an elder, or off pretending to raid the neighbour's goat shed. But make no mistake, raising children is your job. You're not just a mother, you're a trainer of future warriors and marriageable daughters. Your sons need to learn how to fight, farm, and not get hexed by angry neighbours. Your daughters need to know how to run a household, negotiate with charm, and definitely how to fake enthusiasm when their husband turns out to be 42 and smells like seal fat. The pressure to raise strong, respectable children is intense, because their success reflects on you. If your son becomes a great warrior, you're the one who raised him right. If he gets banished for stealing a chicken during a sacred holiday, guess who everyone blames? Hint, it's not the chicken. Let's sprinkle in a little religion while we're at it. You're also responsible for maintaining household rituals, lighting the hearth fire with the right incantation, offering food to the land spirits, carving protective runes near the baby's cradle, making sure the god Thor is properly honoured so he doesn't send a storm to collapse your grain storage. It's all in a day's work. Some women even took on semi-official religious roles, acting as priestesses, spirit mediums, or keepers of sacred objects. If you were one of these women, people might seek you out for blessings, cures, or visions. You weren't just managing your home, you were managing fate. Oh, and while we're on fate, did I mention midwifery? If someone goes into labour, you're probably involved. Birthing was dangerous, messy, and soaked in superstition. You needed to know how to position a breech baby, how to soothe a screaming mother, and what herbs to use if things started going sideways. If the baby survived, great. If not, there might be whispers that you botched it, or worse, that the gods were angry. Either way, it's on your shoulders. Now here's a fringe fact for you. Some Viking women were known to tattoo their children with protective runes, not in the flashy, full-sleeve sense, but with subtle marks meant to ward off disease or misfortune. We don't have definitive archaeological proof for this, but some travellers' accounts and saga references hint at the possibility. Imagine that. Part nurse, part priestess, part warrior mother, and now amateur tattoo artist. If your husband is away for long periods, which, let's be honest, he usually is, you also have to deal with his absence strategically. You need to maintain his property, fend off opportunistic neighbours, and make sure no one challenges your household's authority while he's out playing barbarian businessman. And if word comes back that he died abroad, that's an entirely new saga. You'd be expected to mourn, manage the funeral, settle the estate, and possibly prepare to remarry. Fast. Because land left unclaimed attracts rivals like spilled mead, attracts flies. Even widows had roles to play. Powerful ones. A widow who held land and had sons could sometimes command more respect than a married woman. No husband to answer to, and no one telling her when or how to host a feast. If you played your cards right, widowhood could be a kind of soft power, a retirement plan that let you actually sleep through the night without someone asking where their tunic went. So, by this point, you're realising something crucial. Viking wives weren't just background characters. They were the core engine keeping Norse society from imploding into goat fights and famine. You were judge, chef, manager, diplomat, spiritual advisor, and logistics expert, all rolled into one. And if you did it all flawlessly, you were praised, maybe even immortalized in a saga. If you failed, well, hope you like exile and shame. All that said, some women liked the role. It gave them structure, meaning, and even admiration. They became local legends, not for bearing swords, but for balancing them at their belt alongside ladles and ledger books. And for every woman who quietly managed her home with grace, there were those who ruled with steel in their spine and a dagger in their sleeve. You didn't cross those women. You asked them for advice, so there you are, centre of the storm, firelight in your eyes, knowing every crack in the walls of your longhouse and every secret your servants whisper at night. You're not just a wife, you're a force, a living link between the chaos of the outside world and the fragile peace of the hearth. Let's say the years roll on. You've birthed a few children, buried a few livestock, maybe even outlived that nosy neighbour who once implied your mead was thin. Things feel settled, at least as settled as a Viking life gets, and then it happens. One morning, your husband straps on his sword, kisses your cheek, if he's one of the romantic ones, and says he's heading out for a raid, or a trade, or just to stretch his legs, which you both know means several months of rowing into the unknown, drinking questionable imported ale, and possibly stealing things that weren't nailed down. And you? You're left standing in the doorway wondering if you'll ever see him again. Because here's the hard truth. Viking husbands vanished. Often. Not because they were bad guys, though let's be honest, some of them absolutely were, but because life was volatile. One minute you're planting barley, the next you're getting news that a storm off Shetland wrecked half the fleet. Maybe he drowned. Maybe he's sitting on a British coastline patching up a broken rib and bartering with monks for new sandals. Or maybe, and this is the real kicker, he's perfectly fine, just starting a new life with a second wife and a new name somewhere in the Frankish kingdoms. Men had options, women had waiting. When your husband disappears, the first weeks are quiet. Everyone assumes he'll return. But after a season, the whispers start. Is he dead? Is he cheating? Did he get taken by sea spirits? You're still expected to keep everything running, fields, household, livestock and children, without losing composure. If you break down or show panic, it signals weakness, and weakness invites predators, both the literal kind and the social kind. Now, let's get into the legal muck of it. Different Viking regions had different rules, but generally a woman was expected to wait 3 years before she could declare her husband legally dead and make any moves, whether that meant remarrying, selling property, or splitting inheritance with the children. That's 3 years of uncertainty, managing every single part of your world without knowing whether the man who helped build it with you is alive, dead, or just really bad at time management, and heaven help you if he does return after that. If you've remarried, that's a scandal. If you've claimed his land, expect a very awkward family meeting. Even worse, if he returns with new dependents, a concubine, children, foreign servants. Now your carefully managed household becomes a soap opera. You're expected to make room, play hostess, and pretend you're not screaming internally. Because even if you're the legal wife, there's only so much social capital to go around. Here's a fringe historical tidbit. In some communities, wives of long-absent husbands would leave subtle signs near the hearth or entrance of the home to mark the man as spiritually gone. Not necessarily dead, just no longer part of the family's physical world. These might be symbolic carvings, altered runes, or objects deliberately buried or removed from the longhouse. It was their way of marking emotional closure before the law allowed them to make it official. And what about the emotional toll? Oh, it was brutal. Grief without confirmation is its own kind of madness. You start dreaming of his face, only to wake up and find his side of the bed still cold. You replay your last words. Did you forget to pack him that warm cloak? Did he know the way to the traders' camp in Finland, or was he just winging it? Every unexplained creak in the longhouse becomes a cruel echo, and every travelling merchant who arrives with news from abroad. You hold your breath, praying for closure, one way or another. Now, if your husband was a chieftain or high-ranking warrior, his absence didn't just disrupt your home, it disrupted politics. Allies might see the vacuum as an opportunity to swoop in. Rivals might whisper that your family is weak, your bloodline fading. You might have to step up, attend assemblies, defend property claims, and even rally warriors if things get tense. And you do it all while pretending your heart isn't tied in knots every time you hear a distant horn blow near the fjord. But what if you liked the silence? Some women found a kind of liberation in their husband's absence. Without a man looming over every decision, you had room to lead, to grow. You could rearrange the household, teach your sons the right way to run a farm, make trade decisions without second-guessing, and maybe, even quietly, begin building a life of your own. This autonomy, hard-won and unspoken, could become a kind of strength, and in the eyes of your community, a competent woman keeping her household stable without a man. That earned respect, even admiration. Just don't let it go to your head. Viking society still had rules, and if you stepped too far outside them, you might be accused of overreaching, too bold, too proud, too independent. And that's when things got dangerous. A lone woman with land, sons, and political influence was often seen as a threat, especially by neighbouring families hoping to expand their own holdings. Marrying you off again became a tactic. Bind her, control her assets, silence her voice. So you had to be strategic. Choose your allies carefully. Make sure your son stayed loyal, and for the love of Odin, don't let anyone poison the family's well. That's not just an idiom. It literally happened. There's even a story in Laxdæla Saga where a woman named Gudrun is widowed multiple times, and each time she becomes stronger, more cunning. She navigates feuds, marriages, and legal battles like a queen on a chessboard, but her life is marked by grief, power struggles, and a constant fear that the next man who enters her home might upend it all again. Gudrun isn't a myth. She's a reflection of how women like you had to adapt to survive. If your husband never returned, you became what some sources describe as a household widow, a woman who ran things in his absence but never remarried. You might even take on the role of clan elder, advising younger women, managing disputes, and holding a position of quiet but undeniable influence. You could become the woman people came to for advice, or feared when her voice got quiet. And sometimes that was enough. Not love, not companionship, just power, stability, and the ability to sleep through the night without wondering if your livestock ledger was missing a sheep. But let's not forget the flip side. Some women waited forever. Their husbands never came home. No body, no news, just endless winters of not knowing. These women, neither wives nor widows, lived in limbo. Their children grew, their hair greyed, and still they listened for a boat that never arrived. So here you are. Married, sort of. Alone, for now. And everything you've built rests on your ability to hold steady through silence. Whether your husband is dead, lost, or just off building a second life somewhere warmer, you're the one left holding the keys, the hearth, the stories, and the hope. Let's say you've had enough. Maybe your husband vanished years ago and came back with a new accent and 2 kids who don't look anything like you. Maybe he stayed, but now he drinks too much, accuses the cows of conspiracy, and you haven't had a good night's sleep since the last solar eclipse. Or maybe you're just done. Done with the snoring, the sword polishing, the smug way he misquotes the gods during dinner. You want out. And here's the twist. In Viking society, you actually can leave him. That's right. Divorce was on the menu. No lawyers, no courtroom. Just a socially sanctioned, often extremely awkward unravelling of your once sacred union. Welcome to divorce, Viking style. Now don't get excited. It wasn't a walk in the fjord. The decision wasn't made lightly. There were rules, rituals, and reputations to protect. But unlike most of medieval Europe, where marriage was an eternal sentence you served until death or the plague, did you part, Norse societies actually had legal procedures for ending a marriage. And women? They could initiate it. That alone puts Viking culture light years ahead of many of their medieval neighbours. So how do you do it? First, you have to make your declaration. This wasn't a whisper over dinner. This was a public announcement done in a specific ritualised way. One common method, according to Icelandic legal texts, involves standing at the threshold of your house, or even at the marriage bed, before witnesses and declaring that you were divorcing your spouse. It wasn't subtle. It was meant to be clear, legally binding, and humiliating in just the right measure. Some accounts say the wife would declare her separation 3 times. First inside the house, then at the main entrance, and finally at the local assembly, or thing. This was the Norse way of filing paperwork, loudly, repeatedly, and preferably with someone writing it down in runes. And what were the acceptable reasons? Turns out Viking divorce law was surprisingly pragmatic. Infidelity was on the list, of course, particularly if it involved public humiliation or the illegitimate distribution of resources. But you could also divorce for violence, neglect, or abandonment. If your husband was gone too long, or failed to provide, that was grounds. If he insulted your family or called you humiliating names in front of others, that could be enough too. One 13th century Icelandic law even mentions a case where a wife left her husband because he wore low-cut tunics and spent too much time grooming his beard. Apparently, fashion crimes also qualified as moral failing. But here's where it gets spicy. Just as women could initiate divorce, men could too. If your cooking was bad, if you were infertile, or if you insulted his masculinity in front of others, he might decide he's done. The system was technically equal, but social power wasn't. If your husband had more political allies, he could smear your name in the local thing, maybe even try to take your dowry back. You'd need your own support system, brothers, uncles, a particularly sharp-tongued aunt, to make sure your side of the story stuck. So what happens after the announcement? Well, first, you separate property. This part could be civil or it could be absolute chaos. Remember that mundam, the bride price your family received? Some of that might be reclaimed. Your dowry? You were entitled to take it with you, assuming it hadn't been squandered. If you'd brought land into the marriage, you might get it back, unless someone reinterpreted an old promise, or brought out a conveniently forgotten contract written in very suspicious runes. Children, of course, complicated everything. Sons often stayed with the father, especially if they were nearing adulthood and expected to inherit. Daughters might stay with the mother, or be married off quickly to avoid further scandal. Custody wasn't formalised the way it is today. It was decided by practicality, status, and frankly, which household could support the kid without starving. But what about your reputation? Divorced women weren't necessarily shamed. In fact, many remarried quickly, especially if they were young, attractive, or had good connections. If anything, a woman who walked away from a failed marriage with dignity and her assets intact might be seen as a smart strategist. After all, in a society built on alliances and survival, staying in a doomed partnership could be far more damaging than cutting ties and starting fresh. One saga tells of a woman named Un the Deep-Minded, yes, that's her actual name, who was widowed and later divorced and ended up leading an entire clan to Iceland, managing land deals and living like a queen until her death. She was respected not in spite of her separation from men, but because of her self-reliance afterward. That wasn't the norm, but it happened. Powerful women could wield divorce like a blade, clean, efficient, and unforgettable. Now, for a slightly weirder footnote, some divorces happen symbolically. In one tradition, if a wife took her husband's cloak and laid it at the threshold of their home, it signalled that he was no longer welcome. It was part ritual, part insult, part eviction notice. Cloaks, by the way, were not cheap. This was a message you didn't misinterpret. Another method? Handing back the keys. When a woman gave up her key ring, those physical tokens of authority we mentioned earlier, it meant she was releasing her role, her duty, and frankly her tolerance. Interestingly, divorce didn't always mean the end of cooperation. Some ex-spouses continued to manage land together, especially if their children were involved. Others even attended the same feasts, sat at the same assemblies and exchanged gifts at Yuletide. The Viking world was practical like that. Feuds were messy, and if a clean break helped prevent one, people preferred it. Unless, of course, the divorce sparked the feud, in which case, congrats, you've just started a multi-generational bloodbath over grazing rights and honour. There's even a recorded case of a couple divorcing, remarrying other people, then later divorcing those partners and getting back together. It's like ancient Scandinavian reality TV, only with more sheep. But let's not pretend it was all civilised. Some separations turned violent. Families got dragged into it. Alliances collapsed. If you divorced the wrong person, say, a warlord with a temper, and 5 brothers who all owned axes, you had to be very careful, discreet. Maybe move across the fjord, maybe disappear for a few months and resurface under a different nickname. Everyone knew someone who didn't handle their divorce well and ended up in a shallow grave, or worse, became saga material. And yet, the system existed. That's the miracle. In a time when most cultures locked women into lifelong contracts with zero recourse, Viking society acknowledged that sometimes things fall apart. And when they did, there was a ritual, a process, a structure that, while flawed, still gave women options. You might lose love, but you didn't have to lose everything else. So now you've done it. You've stood at the threshold, declared your intent, taken your keys, and walked out with your head held high. Maybe you'll remarry. Maybe you'll rule your own farmstead. Or maybe you'll take up cedar, whisper to the gods, and become one of those terrifying forest women no one dares cross. Either way, you've proven something crucial. In the brutal reality of Viking marriage, knowing when to walk away was sometimes the greatest strength of all. So, you've either survived your marriage or burned it to the ground with the full force of Norse legality. Either way, you've learned something critical. Viking unions aren't just about hearth and home, they're about power. Real, raw, clan-based power. And nowhere is that more obvious than in marriages made not for love or lust, but for politics. That's right. We're stepping into the elite realm now, where marrying the right person could mean peace between rival clans, or spark the next bloodbath over a sheep pasture. In Viking society, marriage wasn't just personal, it was strategy. Picture this. You're the daughter of a petty king, sitting in your longhouse surrounded by the smell of smoked herring and simmering stew, and your father just announced you're getting married. Not to someone from down the fjord, not even to someone from your own kingdom. Nope. You're being sent off to wed the second son of a jarl across the sea because, get this, he controls a key trading harbour your father wants access to. Romantic? Not really. Necessary? Absolutely. High-status Viking marriages were political chess moves. They weren't about personal compatibility or mutual hobbies, unless your hobby was reinforcing clan dominance or acquiring more grazing land. Marriages linked families, forged alliances, and, if done right, cemented peace between rival factions who otherwise would have been stabbing each other over firewood. You, the bride, were often the glue holding this uneasy truce together, and if the marriage failed, yeah, so did the alliance, which meant things got bloody fast. And don't think this was just about women being traded like cattle. Men were pawns too. Marrying off a younger son to the daughter of a rival could mean elevation for your family, more land, a stronger military bond, or access to a sacred site. But it came with risks. If the marriage soured or the in-laws got ambitious, your shiny new alliance could twist into a political nightmare. There are multiple saga accounts of in-laws who went from smiling at weddings to orchestrating ambushes in the woods within a season. One infamous case? The marriage between Gudrun Osvifrsdottir and Thorkel Eyjolfsson from Laxdæla saga. On the surface, it looked like a match of equals. Power, wealth, prestige. But underneath, tensions simmered. Their marriage became entangled in inheritance disputes, spiritual omens, and more than one suspiciously timed boating accident. Let's just say it didn't end well, and it sure didn't unify their families in the way everyone hoped. It wasn't just local politics either. Some Viking marriages were international deals. Norse elites married into Irish, Scottish, and even Frankish nobility. The famous Rollo of Normandy, allegedly descended from Norse raiders, cemented his position by marrying a Frankish noblewoman. It helped transform him from a glorified pirate into the founder of an entire duchy. A wife, in this case, was basically his visa, passport, and peace treaty rolled into one. But with high-stakes unions came high-stakes expectations. If you were married into another clan, you were expected to be loyal to both your birth family and your new in-laws, and sometimes that meant impossible choices. If your father and your husband went to war, whose side were you on? Pick wrong, and you're seen as a traitor. Pick right, and you're still stuck attending funerals for people you might have loved. This wasn't just emotional strain, it was lethal. One wrong word at a feast could turn into an insult. One misplaced alliance could end in poison. Here's a fringe detail that gets overlooked. In some cases, the marriage arrangement included hostage clauses. That's right. Just in case things went sideways, you might be required to leave a sibling or a younger cousin with your in-laws as a kind of insurance policy, a human guarantee. If your family broke the alliance, that person paid the price. So your marriage came with a side order of constant, quiet dread. Nothing says romance like knowing your cousin's life depends on your ability to smile at feasts and pretend everything's fine. And then there's the question of children. In high-status marriages, offspring weren't just babies, they were leverage. A son meant a potential heir, someone to inherit land, titles, and the accumulated grudges of 3 generations. A daughter? Another marriageable asset to be dangled in front of the next clan with desirable land and too many unmarried sons. Your womb wasn't just a biological function, it was a factory for treaties and succession plans. If you failed to produce children, or produced the wrong kind, meaning too many daughters or a sickly heir, you could be blamed. Some women were even sent back to their families, considered a bad investment. Others were quietly replaced, either by concubines or by new wives entirely, especially once Christian influence began pushing monogamy harder. And if your marriage ended in scandal, you didn't just ruin a relationship, you potentially doomed an entire political alliance. Here's something scholars still debate. How much say did these high-status Viking women actually have in their marriages? The sagas hint at strong personalities, women who negotiated, threatened, and demanded better matches. But how much of that was literary exaggeration? It's not clear. Some argue these women had real influence behind the scenes, whispering in ears, making introductions, setting terms. Others say they were simply better at surviving a system they couldn't truly control, but even if you had no say in who you married, you could still shape what the marriage became. A clever wife could influence her husband, steer policy, and serve as an informal diplomat. You'd host banquets with just the right seating chart to cool off tense alliances. You'd send gifts, embroidered cloth, exotic spices, fine-brewed mead to your father-in-law to keep him sweet. You'd train your children not just to farm or fight, but to navigate. Politics, emotions, fragile egos, all of it. And if things fell apart, you weren't helpless. Divorcing a politically powerful man was tricky but not impossible. If your own family had muscle, you could retreat to them, reclaim your dowry, and remarry into a more stable situation. And sometimes, just sometimes, your story would become legend. A tale of the woman who held a kingdom together, or tore one apart. Because in Viking society, power didn't always swing from a sword. Sometimes it clinked softly at the waist in the form of keys. Sometimes it was passed in coded glances across a smoky longhouse. And sometimes it was born of a single decision: who you marry and why. So if you're standing there, fur-lined cloak billowing in the sea wind, about to take the hand of a stranger who could either make you a queen or a cautionary tale, remember, this isn't about you. Not really. It's about the clans behind you, the bloodlines before you, and the future you're expected to shape with nothing more than diplomacy, dinner parties, and deadly patience. Let's say your marriage wasn't political, not directly. You weren't brokered like a treaty between rival jarls, and your husband didn't show up at your longhouse with 50 warriors and a harp-playing poet. Maybe you married a farmer, a fisherman, or a warrior whose only inheritance was a rusty axe and a strong jawline. Things seemed simple. Manage the land, raise the kids, survive the winters, and then someone in your husband's family offends someone in yours, or you inherit a strip of land that two clans think they deserve, or God's help you, your marriage was supposed to end a feud, and accidentally restarts it. Suddenly, your humble little union is a battlefield. Because in Viking society, a wedding wasn't just a party. It was a line drawn in blood between families, and sometimes the match that lights the pyre. Clan feuds were the unofficial national sport of Viking Age Scandinavia. Forget chess. These were long, complicated vendettas that lasted for decades, even centuries. And while feuds often started with cattle theft, property disputes, or a poorly timed insult at a feast, they could just as easily be sparked or worsened by marriage, especially if the marriage crossed old boundaries. Say your family has a long-standing grudge against another clan. Maybe there was a killing 3 generations ago, or a land dispute no one remembers the details of but everyone still resents. Then boom, your son falls in love with their daughter, or your brother marries a woman whose cousin once poisoned your uncle's horse. On paper, it's a peace offering. In reality, it's a fragile truce, just waiting for someone to sneeze the wrong way. You might be expected to play diplomat. As the new wife, you become the link between 2 tense camps. You attend both family feasts, send gifts during Yule, and do your best to make sure no one drinks too much and brings up that unfortunate incident with the missing goat herd. But you also know the truth. If things go wrong, you're first in the line of fire, metaphorically and maybe literally. Here's a perfect example from the sagas. Njal's saga, one of the most blood-soaked, emotionally exhausting pieces of literature ever carved into calfskin. In it, multiple marriages are arranged to seal peace between feuding clans. Spoiler, none of them work. A woman named Hallgerda marries into the household of Njal, a wise man trying to avoid conflict. But Hallgerda's pride, her hunger for power, and her refusal to let an insult go unavenged drag everyone down with her. Her marriages become weapons, people die, homes burn. It's one long reminder that no matter how well you plan your marriage, you can't control what happens when human ego enters the chat. In fact, Marriages used to patch feuds were sometimes called atonement marriages. The idea was simple. If one family wronged another, say, by killing a relative, the aggrieved party might accept a bride as compensation. Not money, not livestock, a woman. As if her womb and labour could somehow cancel out a blood debt. You'd move into the home of the people your kin hurt, carry their children, and smile through every awkward feast. In theory, this was supposed to create unity. In practice, it often made things worse. Because who really forgets murder over stew and candlelight? If you were unlucky, you became a pawn in a game of vengeance you barely understood. If you were clever, you used your position to control the game. There are tales, rare but chilling, of women who manipulated these feuds from the shadows, whispering, suggesting, encouraging their husbands to avenge slights, or holding them back when it suited them. They weren't always villains. Sometimes they were survivors, using the only tools they had to shape a world that never really protected them. And when the blood spilled, the women suffered too. If your husband's family decided to raid your birth clan's farm, what side did you take? Did you warn your brothers? Did you beg your husband to show mercy? Or did you stay silent and hope the gods didn't punish you for your indecision? There was no winning position, just different flavours of loss. Scholars still debate how much choice women had in these marriage feud. Entanglements. Some argue women were bartered like livestock, their opinions irrelevant. Others say saga women display significant agency, choosing, influencing, even sabotaging their marriages based on old grudges. Either way, the emotional toll was undeniable. You weren't just risking your happiness. You were gambling your life and your family's future on a social contract written in ale, blood, and shaky promises. Here's a strange historical detail. In some rare cases, marriage contracts included clauses that acknowledged the risk of rekindling a feud. Essentially an early version of the no returns, no lawsuits fine print. If the marriage failed and the clans returned to fighting, neither side could claim surprise. That tells you something. People knew these unions were volatile, but they made them anyway, because power and peace were worth the gamble. And if your marriage went sour without a feud, congratulations, you might just start one. Say your husband mistreated you, your brothers got wind of it, maybe they confronted him, insulted his manhood, threw a few chairs, your husband retaliated, and suddenly your divorce isn't just messy, it's a war. Not over love, but over honour. And honour in Viking culture wasn't some fluffy concept. It was the glue holding everything together. Lose it, and you lose everything. Honour was why feuds couldn't die, why apologies had to be accompanied by gifts, why marriages had to be arranged and rearranged like chess pieces. If someone slighted your family, you married their cousin. If someone killed your father, you might marry their sister, then kill him at your wedding feast. Saga logic. Messy, beautiful, brutal saga logic. Here's a fringe example that reads like ancient gossip. A woman in one saga poisons her husband during a peace feast. Not because she hates him, because she knows his death will reignite a feud her family has long wanted to resume. She's not a villain, she's just playing a different game. One the men around her never even knew she was part of. So if you're standing at your wedding feast, looking across the longhouse at a sea of faces, some smiling, some wary, some definitely plotting, you'd better understand the stakes. You're not just a bride. You're a potential bomb, a patch, a pressure point, and whether your marriage ends in peace or blood depends less on love and more on timing, clan loyalty, and who got the bigger slice of roast boar at dinner. Let's dim the firelight, stir the smoke a little, and talk about something that lingers just beyond the edge of the known, the ancient Viking art of sorcery, and how it slithered its way into their marriages. Because when love and politics weren't enough, and let's face it, they often weren't, there were other ways to get what you wanted. Magic ways. Dark ways. Welcome to Cedar, the murky, unsettling, oddly empowering practice of Viking witchcraft, and its role in the drama of desire. Imagine this. You're in love. Or you think you are. Maybe it's the warrior from 2 villages over, the one with the perfect braid and a voice like storm winds. Or maybe it's your neighbour's husband who keeps giving you that long, suspiciously poetic stare while helping you carry firewood. You know there's no way your family will approve. His clan hates yours, or he's already married, or you're 12 and your father's saving you for a more lucrative alliance. What's a girl to do? You go find a Völva. That's the Norse term for a sorceress, a seeress, a woman who walks sideways through the world, part healer, part prophet, part social powder keg. She lives outside the village, possibly in a turf-roofed house with goats that act a little too intelligent. People fear her, but they also bring offerings, a bit of silver, a loaf of honey bread, a promise, and in exchange they ask for glimpses of fate, or for a nudge in a more romantic direction. Yes, Viking love spells were real. Not in the Disney sense, no singing teacups, but in the deeply unsettling bury this under a full moon sense. A Velva might carve runes into bones or sticks and whisper your lover's name 3 times into a bowl of blood. She might tell you to sleep with a lock of your beloved's hair under your pillow, or to bury a charm under his threshold so he dreams of nothing but your eyes. This wasn't cute magic. This was manipulation, will-bending. And if it worked, you didn't get a fairy tale. You got obsession, and that's where things get grim. Because the old Norse knew that magic had consequences, especially cedar, which was considered a feminine and therefore deeply suspicious art. For a man to practice it was to risk his masculinity, his honour, even his life. Odin himself, the Allfather, practiced cedar, and while that gave it divine weight, it also made people deeply uncomfortable. If the king of gods could cross into this strange shadowy power, what did that say about the boundaries of gender, status and control? Some scholars argue that Viking women used cedar to protect themselves in marriages they couldn't control. Think about it. If you're 15, married to a man twice your age, and living in a longhouse where your opinion matters about as much as the soot on the rafters, wouldn't you be tempted to call on the spirits? To mix a potion that makes your husband dream of peace instead of war? To carve a charm that keeps the concubine silent and the in-laws polite? Cedar offered a sense of agency, even if it came with a risk. Of course, not all magic was about love or lust. There were curses too. Galder, the magical chance, could be used to bind, confuse, or even kill. You could curse a rival bride so her weaving unravelled and her mead spoiled. You could curse a husband so his strength failed him in battle, or, more awkwardly, in bed. There's an infamous rune inscription found carved into a piece of wood. May he never get satisfaction with any woman but me. A love spell? Maybe. A curse? Almost definitely. Jealousy is eternal. Magic was also used in fertility. Couples desperate for children might seek blessings from a vulva, perform rituals under the full moon, or carry enchanted objects meant to open the womb. These charms might include stones shaped like eggs, runes carved into driftwood, or even animal bones soaked in blood. Fertility was everything in Viking society. If a marriage failed to produce heirs, it wasn't just sad, it was dangerous. Lineages crumbled, property drifted, and people started looking for reasons. Sometimes that reason was infertility, sometimes it was a curse, and sometimes someone got blamed whether it was true or not. Here's a fringe fact. Some archaeological sites have turned up strange items in Viking graves, little pouches filled with herbs, carved bones, and twisted cords. Some believe these were magical kits, tools of Sidon, meant to follow the dead into the afterlife. Others think they were protection against curses. After all, what if your rival wife slipped a charm under your bedding before you died? You'd want insurance, spiritual prenups if you will. Of course there were skeptics even back then. Not everyone believed in spells. Some mocked vulvas, called them frauds, accused them of being mad women who drank too much fermented goat milk and talked to birds. Others respected their power but feared it, because once someone's been seen working magic you never really trust them again. They could bless you with one hand and doom your children with the other. A dangerous friend. A terrifying enemy. Cedar wasn't officially outlawed until Christianity took root, and even then it lingered in the corners. People still whispered about love charms, still left offerings at crossroads, still carved runes into hidden doorposts. Old habits die hard, especially the ones that promise power in a world that offers so little of it, especially to women. And what about men? Could they use magic in love? Technically, yes, but it was a minefield. A man practicing cedar risked being labelled ergi, a slur implying cowardice, femininity, and sexual deviance. That label could destroy reputations. Entire duels were fought over such accusations. So most men stayed far away from love magic, preferring to let women handle it, or to marry the one casting the spells and pretend they never noticed the small pile of fox bones hidden in her cloak. So here you are, a Viking wife, or would-be wife, caught in the web of longing, strategy and desperation. Maybe you loved someone who didn't love you back. Maybe you feared losing the one thing that gave your life meaning. Maybe you just wanted to feel powerful in a world that kept calling you weak. And maybe, late at night, you found yourself walking toward the woods with a token clutched in your fist, praying that the vulva would see you, not because you're wicked, but because you're human. And in the brutal, beautiful, burning world of Viking marriage, even the strongest hearts sometimes reach for the shadows. Death is never far in Viking life. It hangs in the cold air, it waits at the bottom of fjords, and it rides the edge of every battle, every childbirth, every voyage made with more ambition than rations. And in Viking marriage, death doesn't always mean goodbye. Sometimes it means something darker, something clingier. Tonight, let's unravel the shadowy tangle of ghost husbands, death vows, and the eerie belief that, in some cases, love, or obligation, didn't stop when the heart did. Picture this. Your husband goes off on a raid, promising to return by summer with enough silver to roof the longhouse and a fancy comb from the east for your hair. You wait. Seasons change. No word. Then one night, just after the snow begins to melt, you wake to find him standing at the foot of your bed, pale, silent, still dripping seawater onto the floor. He doesn't speak. He doesn't move. But you know what he is. Draugr, a revenant. The dead, returned not for closure, but for unfinished business. Vikings believed in many types of undead, but the Draugr is special. Not a mindless zombie, but a sentient, spiteful corpse, often jealous, possessive, and just functional enough to strangle a neighbour or trample a herd if provoked. In sagas, Draugr often return because they were wronged, buried improperly, or couldn't let go of earthly attachments. A wife, a sword, a feud. In some stories, they haunt their own widows, particularly if she remarried too quickly, or, gods forbid, found happiness again. So you, the grieving widow, might perform elaborate rituals to prevent your husband's return. You'd place scissors on his chest to cut his spirit's path back. You might bury him with iron being a protective metal, or tie his big toes together so he couldn't walk. But if you loved him, if you couldn't let go, you might skip those steps, or worse, you might invite him back. Enter the death vow, a chillingly romantic, or just plain chilling, Norse idea where one spouse promises to follow the other in death, usually made in the heat of grief, sometimes, though, planned. If you die first, I'll follow, they say. And sometimes they mean it. A few accounts describe women voluntarily dying, through exposure, starvation, or ritual, shortly after their husbands, believing their souls were meant to travel together. Sometimes these deaths weren't entirely voluntary. Think quiet pressure or cultural expectations turned lethal. But it wasn't always the woman. In some stories, the husband takes his own life to follow a beloved wife, though less often. Men were supposed to grieve, sure, but also to move on, remarry, and keep the bloodline strong. Women, on the other hand, were sometimes expected to become living ghosts, their usefulness tied to loyalty even beyond the grave. And yes, higher status circles, burial customs reflected this. Elite Viking men were sometimes buried with female companions, wives, slaves, or concubines, who may or may not have been given much say in the matter. Some archaeologists have found signs of ritual deaths accompanying male burials. Strangulation marks, knife wounds, drugged remains. There's still debate over whether these women were sacrificed willingly, coerced, or forced. But the message is clear. In death, as in life, some marriages didn't have an exit ramp. Now for a strange and unsettling fringe fact. There are stories of Viking widows keeping a physical connection to their dead spouses. Not just mourning jewellery or heirlooms, but body parts, teeth, bits of hair. Occasionally relics wrapped in cloth and tucked into pouches worn daily. Some scholars argue these were tokens of love. Others suggest they were tools of sorcery, used to summon dreams, bind spirits, or ensure the dead didn't rise in anger. Either way, not exactly the kind of keepsake you put on the mantle. And what about dreams? Viking widows often claim to be visited by their husbands in sleep. Sometimes these were comforting, gentle visions. He stands by the fire, says he's watching over you, reminds you where he hid the silver. Other times, not so much. He curses your new lover. He demands revenge. He tells you he's cold, angry, unfinished. And if you ignore him, well, the animals start acting strangely. Milk spoils. The hearth won't stay lit. The baby cries all night. Viking belief didn't separate the spiritual from the everyday, it interwove it. A dead husband wasn't just a memory, he was a presence, one you had to manage. In one Icelandic saga, a man returns from death not to haunt his wife, but to help her. He appears to her in a dream and warns her of a storm saving the harvest. In another, a woman's dead husband sits silently at their feast each Yule, glaring at the man she remarried. Eventually guests stop coming. Eventually she stops eating. Eventually she dies too. The sagas don't always make it clear whether this is horror or justice, just inevitability. And here's the uncomfortable scholarly debate. Were these stories literal beliefs or literary devices? Did Vikings truly expect revenants to walk the earth for marital drama, or were these tales meant to moralise about loyalty, grief, and the cost of moving on? Hard to say. What's clear is that these stories meant something. That marriage, in the Viking mind, wasn't just a social contract, it was a soul contract. Something signed not only in dowries and ale, but in shadow and ash. There were ways to protect yourself, of course. Widows could remarry, but it was wise to wait a respectful period, to bury the dead properly, say the right prayers, leave offerings, sometimes even appeal to the gods for permission. A widow who rushed into a second marriage was seen as suspect, not just socially but spiritually. After all, what if your first husband wasn't done with you? It's worth noting that some widows never remarried, not out of grief but out of strategy. If you were well connected and childless, remaining unmarried meant you retained control of your dowry and property. Remarriage could mean losing that independence to a new husband, so the wisest move? Stay loyal to the dead. Whether you were actually still loyal, well, that depended on how often his ghost was checking in. And if you were the one who died first, you hoped your husband would honour your memory, maybe light a candle at Yule, maybe name a daughter after you, maybe not marry your cousin 6 months later and pretend you never existed. But again, no guarantees. The afterlife, like marriage, was uncertain, full of surprises, and occasionally haunted by bad decisions. So here you are, sitting by the fire. The longhouse is quiet. Your husband's cloak still hangs by the door, though he's been gone a year, maybe longer. And sometimes when the wind howls through the cracks, you swear you hear his voice. Not calling your name, just watching, waiting, wondering if the vows you made were for this world or the next. So let's set aside the longboats, axes and oaths for a moment, and lean into a quieter, more complicated corner of Viking life. One that historians don't always agree on, and saga writers often sidestepped with a careful cough into their mead. Tonight we're stepping into the shadows of the Longhouse and asking a question that probably would have gotten you some very intense looks in a Norse assembly. What about same-sex love in the Viking world? Was it real? Was it tolerated? And what happens when the brutal machinery of Viking marriage slams into a heart that doesn't quite follow the script? First, the hard truth. The historical record is frustratingly vague. The Norse left behind thousands of runestones, sagas and law codes, but very few of them talk directly about same-sex relationships, let alone marriages. When they do, it's either in veiled insults or cryptic poetry that leaves more questions than answers. But if you read between the lines, if you sift through the ash and the frost and the occasional suspiciously poetic metaphor, some things start to take shape. Start with the sagas. These are packed with testosterone, men wrestling in fjords, exchanging blood oaths, swearing eternal loyalty, and occasionally sharing beds for warmth during snowstorms. Is it love? Is it practicality? Depends on the translator, the scholar, and how much they're willing to read into lines like, "They loved each other more than was proper." Because that line appears multiple times, usually in stories where two warriors grow so close, so bonded, that the wives in the background become silent or non-existent. It's not proof, but it's certainly a raised eyebrow in narrative form. And then there are the insults. The Vikings had an entire class of verbal dueling called flyting, where warriors would sling poetic insults at each other like weaponized haikus. Some of the harshest digs? Accusations of ergi, a term loosely meaning effeminacy, but often laced with accusations of same-sex behaviour, particularly the receptive male role. In Viking society, this wasn't just rude, it was a legal insult. Call someone ergi, and you might be challenged to a duel. Why? Because masculinity in Norse culture was rigid, brittle, and bound up in dominance. A man could do many wild things, raid, pillage, wear a bear's skull as a hat, but being seen as passive or unmanly could shred his reputation faster than a sword through seal hide. But here's where it gets slippery. The sagas, despite their chest-thumping masculinity, occasionally hint at something more tender, warriors choosing to die beside their male companions, mourning them more deeply than their own brothers, swearing to avenge them even above a slain spouse. There are passages that pulse with emotion, unspoken, unacknowledged, but very real. Love? Possibly. Grief doesn't lie, even if the sagas do. Women, meanwhile, are even more hidden. Female same-sex love barely shows up at all, likely because women's inner lives weren't often recorded, but there are whispers. Stories of shield maidens who never married, of priestesses who lived together, sharing everything but names. In some laws, there are penalties mentioned for women engaging in unseemly acts with one another, usually cloaked in euphemism, but the implication is clear enough. The existence of a punishment suggests that the act itself wasn't unknown. And then there's the poetry. Norse skaldic verse is nothing if not intense, and occasionally it gets interesting. One fragment hints at a female warrior praising the beauty of another's eyes before battle. Another refers to a man whose heartbeat as his comrade bled, a line so loaded with emotion it might as well come with a mixtape. None of this is courtroom evidence, but it's enough to raise the question. Were there Vikings who defied the heterosexual script? Almost certainly. Did they live openly? That's harder to say. Here's a fringe fact that gets swept under the fur rug. Some Viking burials suggest non-traditional roles. There's the famous Birka grave in Sweden, originally believed to be a high-ranking male warrior due to the weapons and battle gear buried with the body. But when DNA analysis revealed the skeleton was biologically female, the academic world had a minor meltdown. Was this a woman who lived as a man, a warrior who defied gender norms, or someone buried with honours that defied their biological sex? We don't know, but it shattered a few long-held assumptions about what Vikings would and wouldn't tolerate. Which brings us to Viking marriage. Could same-sex couples legally marry? Probably not. Norse law codes are very specific about the transactional nature of marriage. Bride prices, dowries, childbearing, land inheritance. Marriage was a machine built to produce heirs, secure alliances, and stabilise property lines. 2 men or 2 women couldn't fulfil those economic expectations, and Viking society was not known for tolerating arrangements that didn't benefit the family tree. But informal unions? Lifelong companionships? Possibly. There may have been couples who lived together, shared resources and raised eyebrows, but weren't publicly challenged because they kept the peace and didn't threaten inheritance lines. In close-knit communities, what mattered most was not disrupting the balance, and if 2 people loved each other quietly, kept their drama private, and pulled their weight at harvest time, the rest might have been overlooked. And what if they were discovered? Consequences range from mockery to exile to worse. Depending on your status, being outed could ruin your standing. A low-status farmer might be laughed out of the village. A noble's son could face disgrace, even execution if politics got ugly. But again, it depended. Viking justice was inconsistent, sometimes brutal, sometimes weirdly practical. If you were valuable to your clan, they might ignore the rumours. If you weren't. The fjord is cold, and accidents happen. Some scholars suggest that Viking society viewed love as secondary to duty. You could love who you wanted, as long as you married who you were told to, and many probably did. A man could marry a woman, father children, and still carry secret feelings for his battle companion. A woman could fulfill her role as a wife, while dreaming of the shield maiden she trained with as a girl. These inner lives didn't leave runestones, but they left echoes, and maybe that's the key. Viking marriage wasn't built for love, not in the way we think of it now. It was a system, a social contract, a battlefield in its own right. But love, quiet, inconvenient and stubborn, slipped through the cracks. Between the sagas and the silence, between the feast and the fire, there were always people who wanted what they weren't supposed to want, and some of them quietly, defiantly found it. So tonight, if you're imagining yourself in a smoky longhouse, eyes meeting across a crowded table, hearts pounding in a world that doesn't know what to do with you, know this. Even in the harshest societies, love finds a way to haunt the edges, like the wind outside, like a story no one dares write down but everyone knows. If you want to understand Viking marriage, not just the who, but the why, you have to look up. Not the stars, though the Norse were obsessed with those too, but higher still, to the gods. Because marriage in Viking society wasn't just a deal between two families, or a practical arrangement over who gets the better sheep pasture. It was a mirror held up to the divine, and the gods, let me tell you, had feelings. Deep, messy, unfiltered feelings about love, lust, betrayal, and all the glorious chaos in between. Start with Freya, goddess of love, beauty, fertility, sex, war, death, and magic. Basically the Norse pantheon's multitasking queen. Freya was who you called on if you wanted to fall in love, or make someone else fall in love with you. But here's the thing. Freya wasn't just about fluttery hearts and hand-holding. She was fierce. She took lovers across the realms. She wept tears of gold when they left her. She rode a chariot pulled by cats, and she practiced cedar. That controversial magic associated with femininity and frankly social danger. If you were a Viking woman trying to secure a marriage, protect your household, or get pregnant after 3 failed winters, you might whisper a prayer to Freya. You might leave an offering, honey, amber, fine cloth, and hope she was listening. And if she was, well, you might end up with the marriage you wanted, or more likely the one you deserved. Then there's her brother, Freyr, god of fertility, peace, prosperity, and phallic symbols so unsubtle they make modern statues blush. Freyr fell in love with a beautiful giantess, Gerda, and gave away his magic sword to win her. Yes, his sword. In Viking symbolism, that's about as Freudian as it gets. His decision, a god literally giving up his weapon to secure love, was controversial even among the other deities. Odin probably rolled his one good eye hard enough to cause a thunderstorm, but it illustrates something deep in Norse thinking. Love is powerful. Love can disarm you. Love can be both triumph and tragedy. And marriage? Marriage is where that tension plays out. Freya and Freyr weren't background characters in Norse spirituality. They were invoked at weddings, called on in fertility rituals, woven into songs sung beside the hearth when the bride's belly stayed stubbornly flat. Some Viking couples even swore oaths at sacred groves dedicated to them, believing that if the gods heard their vows, their union would be protected, or, at the very least, feared. And then, of course, there's Odin, the All-Father, the one-eyed, knowledge-thirsty, war-obsessed trickster king of Asgard. Odin's relationships weren't exactly a blueprint for domestic bliss. His marriage to Frigg was less candlelit dinners and more long periods of mysterious absences and cryptic prophecy. Frigg, for her part, knew the future but rarely shared it, which is just as well, because being married to Odin meant watching him sacrifice himself, lie to everyone, and flirt with witches while pretending it was for the greater good. Still, Odin and Frigg represented something central to Viking marriage: strategic alliance. They were divine power couple goals, each wielding influence in different spheres. Frigg ruled over marriage, motherhood, and fate. Odin ruled over literally everything else, including the kind of secret, shadowy wisdom that made him the ultimate manipulator. In some ways, their marriage reflected what many Vikings experienced: a man off chasing glory, a woman holding down the fort and quietly pulling the strings. It's worth noting that Frigg is also associated with fidelity and household honour. Her very name was invoked in marriage oaths, but even she couldn't stop her own son, Balder, from dying, proof that even divine mothers and wives had limits. If the gods couldn't control fate, what hope did mortals have? Now for the truly weird part: Loki, the chaos agent, the shapeshifter, the god of trickery, insults, gender fluidity, and catastrophic family dinners. Loki's love life is famously flexible. He changes sex. He births monsters. He insults everyone's marriages in poetic verse. In one particularly strange myth, he transforms into a mare and gives birth to an 8-legged horse. Don't ask, just nod. Loki shows us that Viking beliefs around love and identity weren't always neat. They were complicated, contradictory, and occasionally involved mythical horse babies. Loki also exposes the sharp edge of Viking morality. In one poem, he accuses nearly every goddess of adultery, implying that even the most divine marriages were full of secrets infidelity, and regret. It's scandalous. It's soap opera worthy. It's also incredibly human. If the gods couldn't stay loyal, how could anyone else? And what did all this mythological mess mean for your average Viking? Quite a bit, actually. The gods weren't remote figures sitting in golden palaces judging human behaviour. They were models. Their stories explained why marriage could be hard, why love could hurt, why choosing between passion and duty felt like picking between fire and frost. If a woman left her husband for another man, people didn't just gossip. They compared it to Freya's lovers. If a man gave up power to marry someone of a lower status, they said he was doing like Freya. These stories gave shape to experience, even when they didn't offer comfort. Wedding ceremonies themselves often included nods to the divine. Swords passed between families echoing Freya's sacrifice. Toasts were made to Thor for strength and to Freya for fertility. Even the wedding bed, yes, the one with all the awkward public implications, was sometimes blessed in the names of the gods. Marriage wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. Fail at it, and you risk not just social shame, but spiritual imbalance. Here's a fringe fact to top things off. Some archaeologists believe that certain carved figures found in grave goods, previously labelled as idols or toys, were actually miniature representations of Freya or Frigg, used in household rituals around marriage and childbirth. Little goddesses, tucked into linen drawers or hidden in roof beams, quietly watching over women trying to survive both husbands and winters. Protection? Yes, but also a silent witness. And even with Christianity creeping in during the later Viking Age, these beliefs didn't vanish overnight. Newly Christian, Vikings still swore oaths over Thor's hammer while baptizing their children. Priests complained that women prayed to Frigg for fertility. It wasn't heresy, it was habit. Deep, bone-level habit. So if you're a Viking wife kneeling beside the hearth, whispering a prayer into the smoke, you're not just hoping for a good harvest or a peaceful household. You're asking Freya to bless your body. You're asking Frigg to protect your children. You're trying to be brave like Gerdud, clever like Frigg, and when necessary a little bit chaotic like Loki. Because in the end, Viking marriage was never just between two people. It was watched, judged, and mirrored by gods who were just as flawed and just as fascinating as the mortals who worshipped them. If you're picturing a Viking wedding like a Game of Thrones outtake, stormy skies, brooding glances, someone getting stabbed mid-toast, you're not entirely wrong. But truth be told, the actual ceremony was often a bit less dramatic and a lot more practical. Unless, of course, it was held in the dead of winter on a frozen lake, or under the soft orange flicker of 1,000 torches in the heart of summer. Because while Viking weddings varied across regions, clans and generations, one thing remained constant. They were events. Loud, long, symbol-soaked events that marked the moment two people stopped belonging only to their families and started belonging to an entire network of alliances. It was theatre, politics, and social pressure wrapped into a roaring party, and you, dear listener, had better be dressed for the season. Let's talk setting. Viking weddings weren't held in churches, at least not until Christianity started crashing the party, but they weren't exactly done in private either. Most took place on the family farm or in the longhouse, where everyone could see and, more importantly, remember what happened. But sometimes, if the families wanted to show off, they chose sacred or symbolic locations. A hilltop under a full moon, a stone circle rumoured to echo the gods, a frozen river that glittered like silver underfoot. Cold? Sure, but dramatic. Absolutely. And in a society where legacy mattered more than comfort, that kind of drama was half the point. Season mattered too. Summer weddings were most common, because who wants to dance around a bonfire in a snowstorm? But winter ceremonies had their own eerie charm. Picture it. Dark skies, snow like powdered bone, pine torches casting shadows that made everyone look vaguely haunted. Couples who married in winter were seen as tough, people who didn't wait for the sun to come back before tying their fates together, and that reputation, it stuck. Now let's talk clothes. No white dresses here. The bride often wore blue, the Norse colour of purity, not because she'd never known a man necessarily, but because she was stepping into a new life. Blue represented calm, loyalty, and the sea, the great unknown. Her hair might be braided with beads or covered with a headdress that would be removed during the bedding ceremony. More on that horror show later. The groom wore his best tunic, ideally embroidered by a female relative, and carried a weapon, not to fight off exes, but as a symbol of protection and responsibility. And if he was noble, maybe even a sword passed down from his father, polished until it gleamed like freshly spilled truth. Speaking of swords, those things played a big role in the ceremony. In some traditions, the groom gave the bride his ancestral sword to symbolise the transfer of protection. She might keep it, or it might go to their future son when he came of age. The bride, in turn, brought her own symbolic gift: keys to the household, woven textiles, or a family heirloom. These weren't just objects. They were prophecies in metal and wool saying, this is what we are, this is what we bring, this is what we expect. And then came the feast. Oh, the feast! Viking weddings weren't one-night affairs. Some lasted 3 days, others a week, depending on how wealthy or stubborn the families were. There was meat, roasted boar, venison, lamb, and enough ale to refloat a sinking ship. Songs were sung, stories retold, and sometimes a skald would show up to compose a poem on the spot about the bride's hair or the groom's battle record. These performances were part entertainment, part subtle status check. If your wedding didn't get its own poem, you'd hear about it for years. But these weren't just parties, they were rituals. Before the actual vows, there was a ceremony called kaupmal, the formal contract negotiation between families. It often happened in private, away from the drunken crowd, and involved precise discussions about dowries, bride prices, and what would happen if someone broke the union. This was where the real marriage happened, and everyone knew it. The rest was just celebration. That said, the public ceremony mattered too. In some regions, the couple was led to a sacred stone or fire pit and asked to speak vows, simple, blunt declarations in front of witnesses. There weren't flowery speeches or teary-eyed ring exchanges. It was more like, I take you as my spouse. I will share land, food, and fate with you. If you betray me, I will tell your mother and then burn down your barn. Okay, maybe not that last part, but you get the idea. Honesty was the vibe. And here's a strange little fact. Some couples exchanged rings. Sort of. Finger rings weren't common yet, but arm rings were. Heavy, ornate bands of gold or silver worn on the wrist or upper arm, often inscribed with runes or family crests. The groom might give one to the bride, and she might wear it proudly, until the mead ran out and someone's uncle started yelling about inheritance again. Let's not forget the gods. Pre-Christian Viking weddings usually included offerings to deities, especially Freya and Freyr, the power couple of love and fertility. A small animal might be sacrificed. Yes, really. Its blood sprinkled on stones, thresholds, or even the wedding bed. Toasts were made in their honour, and sometimes the couple was blessed by a local goddy, a kind of priest or chieftain, who'd remind them that love was sacred, but also temporary, so enjoy it while it lasts. And then came the transition. After the feast, after the songs, the guests would guide the bride and groom to their bed, sometimes literally. In Icelandic accounts, this included walking the couple to the bedroom with torches, singing fertility songs, and maybe throwing a few awkward jokes their way. In some cases, someone even stayed outside the door to listen for confirmation. Intimacy, optional, performance, required. By morning, everything changed. The bride now had legal status as wife, the groom as husband. Her family's honour was tied to his. His fortune was now hers to manage. They were seen as one social unit, economically, spiritually, and politically. But make no mistake, this wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was just the beginning. The test of a Viking marriage didn't lie in the feast. It lay in the seasons that followed. Could you survive winter together? Could you raise a child and not kill each other? Could you host guests without starting a feud over who sat nearest the fire? One last note. Weddings weren't always joyful. Sometimes the bride was unwilling. Sometimes the families forced the match. Sometimes the entire affair was a smokescreen for a land grab or a fragile peace deal. The food was good. The music was loud. But underneath it all, tension. Weddings could be beginnings, or declarations of war disguised as toasts. So if you're standing there in your finest wool, blue dress swirling in the mountain wind, clutching a ring that used to belong to a man who once punched a bear for fun, know that you're not just a bride, you're a symbol, a hope, a message to everyone watching that your families have made their move, and now you've got a lifetime to see what happens next. So here you are, married, settled, and holding down a household like a champion, maybe even raising a few shaggy-haired kids who run barefoot through sheep fields and occasionally try to duel the neighbour's goat. It's not quite peaceful, but you've got rhythm. Until one day someone new shows up at your longhouse. Maybe it's your husband's orphaned cousin, sent to live with you for fostering. Maybe it's your own younger brother, exiled from your birth clan after an unfortunate axe incident. Or maybe it's that quietly smirking concubine your husband brought back from across the sea. That's right. Tonight, we're diving into the firestorm of Viking domestic life, fosterage, affairs, and the tangled mess of blended families. You might think Viking households were nuclear, just husband, wife and kids, but in truth, they were often bursting with extra people. Fosterage was a big deal in Norse culture, and it wasn't just about charity, it was strategy. Sending your child to be raised in another family wasn't a sign you didn't love them. It was an alliance, an honour, a way to forge lifelong bonds between clans, a way to say, hey, you raised my son to be a warrior, I'll owe you a favour that might involve me stabbing someone for you later. Fostered children became deeply integrated into their new homes. They called their foster parents father and mother, and were often treated as full members of the family, until inheritance season came around and the real bloodline snapped back into focus like a bear trap. But until then, they played with your kids, shared your food, and got into the same trouble, which honestly was plenty. There's a reason saga households read like multi-season dramas with more plot twists than logic. Now, if you're the wife running this household, it means you're feeding, clothing and disciplining not just your own children, but maybe 3 or 4 extras, some of whom come with baggage. Maybe their real mother died. Maybe their birth father was killed in a feud that still simmers just under the surface. You have to balance compassion with politics, affection with caution. Hug them, yes, but don't forget whose blood they carry, and whatever you do, make sure they don't poison the mead. Let's add more fuel to the fire. Viking men, as we've covered, weren't always one-woman types. Concubines weren't just casual flings. Sometimes they lived in the household, under your roof, near your bed, possibly even helping prepare meals or care for your children. In some cases, they were former slaves elevated to mistress status, or war captives given a better life that still included daily humiliation and a complete lack of legal standing. Imagine being the wife, the legal partner, the one with the keys and the heritage and the long-suffering eye roll, and then having to share your space with a younger woman your husband found interesting. Some wives tried to ignore it. Others took command of the situation, keeping the concubine in check and making sure she never forgot her place. And a few lost that battle badly. There are sagas where the concubine rises in favour, the wife gets sidelined, and the children of the lesser woman end up heirs because politics shifted and loyalty proved more important than legal precedent. And if you thought that was spicy, wait until you throw a visiting relative into the mix, because Viking families didn't believe in personal space. Your in-laws could show up unannounced and stay for months, claiming hospitality rights, while quietly judging your stew and subtly suggesting you name your next child after their dead goat. And heaven forbid your brother moves in after a messy divorce or blood feud. Suddenly, you've got another adult in the house, possibly armed, definitely opinionated, and frequently drunk. Now, let's talk about affairs. Yes, Viking society was male-dominated. Yes, the risks were higher for women. But that doesn't mean affairs didn't happen. They did. Secret glances in the mead hall, late-night encounters by the sheepfold, lovers' trysts under the full moon when everyone else was too busy snoring or planning a raid. Affairs were risky, thrilling, and occasionally deadly. If caught, a woman could be divorced, shamed, or worse, especially if her lover was lower status or from a rival clan. But sometimes, she got away with it. One legendary example, Gudrun Osvifrsdottir. She's the star of Laxdela saga, and her romantic history is more tangled than a bramble bush in a thunderstorm. Married 4 times, caught between duty and desire, Gudrun's choices lead to murder, heartbreak, and a whole string of poetic monologues about fate and longing. Was she a villain? A feminist icon? A cautionary tale? Scholars are still arguing about that, which tells you how well she played the game. Now, in this kind of household, half home, half battlefield, you, the wife, are the unofficial ruler. You have to maintain balance, feed everyone, keep the fires lit and the egos cooled. If one child starts bullying another, you handle it. If your husband shows favoritism to the concubine's son, you handle it, preferably without burning the longhouse down. It's politics on a domestic scale, and the only thing more dangerous than open war is a silent one played out in bedtime stories and bread portions. Here's a strange fringe fact. Some households kept detailed oral records, like verbal family trees, memorised by the women. You had to remember who was related to whom, who owed whom a favour, and who tried to sleep with whose wife back in the days before winter solstice. These weren't just stories. They were legal evidence, political ammunition, and social landmines. One wrong word, one misnamed uncle, and you could spark a feud that ruined the next 5 harvests. Also, Viking children weren't dumb. They picked up on everything, which meant your marriage drama, the guest gossip, and your quiet resentment toward that smug foster son who keeps accidentally dropping your loom weights. Yeah, it all seeped into their understanding of loyalty, power, and revenge. These kids weren't just future warriors and wives, they were future storytellers, and one day someone might carve your name into a saga, depending on how gracefully you managed this powder keg of a family. So, let's recap. You've got your own children, your husband's children from a concubine, 2 foster kids from a neighbouring clan, your widowed sister, her baby, an elderly in-law with mysterious flatulence, and maybe a servant who's been with the family so long that no one remembers where she came from. That's your daily life. Feeding them, managing their feuds, preventing accidental arson, making sure the daughter you raise doesn't fall in love with, your foster son. And that the foster son doesn't decide the concubine is more appealing than the local heiress he's betrothed to. And you? You're holding it all together. Every morning you wake up before dawn, stirring embers and boiling porridge, already bracing for another day of social diplomacy dressed as household chores. You know every crack in the walls, every secret in the family, and exactly how much meat it takes to get your husband to stop grumbling about your brother living in the grain loft. You are the centre of a household where everyone is watching, and more than one is waiting to see if you fall. But you won't, because you've learned something most of them haven't. That love, loyalty, and power are all negotiable, and that the hearth is just as much a battlefield as the sea. Love isn't supposed to survive in a world this cold, this practical, this drenched in politics and pig fat. But somehow it does. Not always the grand, sweeping kind that legends are made of, but small, stubborn glimmers, the kind tucked into secret carvings, whispered at twilight, or worn quietly on a chain beneath layers of wool. Tonight, we're zooming in on the romantic fragments of Viking marriage, the rare but radiant signs that even in a culture defined by bloodlines and bargaining, people still manage to fall in love, and sometimes to hold on to it. Start with the runes. Viking runes weren't just for casting curses or labelling who owned which axe, though they definitely did plenty of both. They were also used for messages, tiny intimate inscriptions carved into combs, bone pins, wooden amulets, and even swords. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these artefacts with short but pointed phrases. Think of me, I love you, kiss me. Some are surprisingly tender, others are more like Norse pickup lines carved into antler, rough around the edges but sincere in their own battle-scarred way. One famous find comes from Bergen, Norway, a small stick bearing runic graffiti that says, "You're in my thoughts, come to me." It's dated to the late 12th century, slightly post-Viking Age, but it still pulses with that same earthy emotional charge. Imagine someone secretly carving those words during a storm, slipping the message into a cloak or leaving it beside a bed. Not flashy, just honest, just human. And then there's the jewellery. Viking men and women wore rings, brooches, beads, items that were both decorative and symbolic. A man might give his bride a brooch etched with protective runes, or a twisted silver arm ring to match his own. Worn openly, these gifts told a story. We are joined. Worn secretly, they told another, I remember you. Some of these objects were buried with the wearer, others passed on as heirlooms, their meaning whispered from one generation to the next like a secret too beautiful to forget. Wedding gifts often carried this emotional weight. While much of Viking marriage was transactional, property exchanged, alliances forged, there was room for personal gestures. A man might commission a knife with a carved handle for his bride, or a belt with her family's symbols woven into the leather. Women sometimes gifted embroidered tunics or woven sashes, decorated with intricate knotwork patterns or subtle animal motifs that referenced private jokes or shared memories. These weren't just practical items, they were emotional investments, stitched with care and worn with pride. And if you're thinking Viking love was all stoicism and side glances, remember, they had poetry. And it could be soft. Viking Age skaldic poetry is often remembered for its complex metaphors and epic heroics, but there's also a quieter strain, love poems, riddles and longing verses written in the margins of saga manuscripts or memorised across lifetimes. Some are anonymous, some attributed to known poets, and some passed down as oral tradition, their original authors lost in the snowdrifts of time. Here's one fragment translated from Old Norse. Your hair, a wave of night, I see you even in sleep, the world colder when you are not near. Not exactly Shakespeare, but considering the average Viking day involved hauling fish, dodging frostbite, and making sure your goats didn't wander into a neighbour's stew pot, this kind of softness is almost miraculous. But love wasn't always celebrated. In fact, open displays of affection were often considered inappropriate, especially for women. A wife was expected to be loyal, efficient, and politically astute. She could admire her husband, sure, and even mourn him deeply if he died, which, let's face it, happened a lot. But passion, public declarations, that was risky. It made people nervous. After all, if you loved too fiercely, what else were you willing to do? Break rules? Defy your clan? Still, stories slipped through. There's a saga where a woman risks exile to follow the man she loves into hiding after he's accused of murder. Another, where a husband rescues his wife from a forced remarriage, braving a storm and a curse just to reach her. Are these embellishments? Probably. But they reflect what people wanted to believe, that love could be stronger than obligation, or at least slip between its cracks. One especially strange tradition, carved love knots. These were symbols etched into wood or stone, often with no names, just a design, complex looping lines that never ended. Some scholars believe they were romantic markers, a secret sign shared between lovers. Others argue they were just decorative, but the repetition of these symbols in domestic settings, above hearths, under beds, on keepsakes, suggests they meant more than simple decoration. They were a promise, a wish. And yes, love could spark marriages, though rarely in the traditional sense. If a man and woman wanted to marry for love, they needed support from both families and often had to wait until the timing was just right. But it did happen. There are sagas about young couples who fall for each other and spend years trying to convince their families to approve. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes someone gets murdered. Viking romance was rarely low stakes. Even divorce, as we've seen, could be laced with love. Some separated couples continued to exchange gifts or raise children together. Some even remarried. Love didn't always end when the contract did. And sometimes, just sometimes, it endured long after. There are tombs where husbands and wives are buried together, their bodies curled toward each other. There are runestones that speak of lost spouses with tenderness. He died far from home. I built this in his memory. He was my only love. One fringe theory that still sparks debate among scholars, that some Viking households engaged in hand-fasting, a ritual form of betrothal that could be undone, essentially a trial marriage. Two people could pledge themselves for a year and a day, and if it didn't work out, they parted ways without scandal. Was it legal? Semi? Was it common? Unclear. But it reflects an understanding that love needs space, that sometimes hearts change, and that wasn't shameful, it was simply life. So where does this leave you? In your longhouse with your practical marriage, your chores, your foster kids, and that one necklace you still keep hidden in a carved box under the floorboards? It leaves you remembering. That once, maybe, someone carved your name into driftwood. That your husband once brought you a comb with shells embedded in the teeth and said, awkwardly, "This reminded me of your hair." That there were moments, small, quiet ones, when the transaction felt like something more, because even in a world where love was rarely the point sometimes, it still found a way to matter. There are rules in Viking marriage. Some are spoken aloud, about dowries, land, inheritance and loyalty, and others are carved into bone-deep tradition. But when those rules are broken, when someone steps outside the boundaries of honour, of fidelity, or even just of discretion, That's when the brutal part of Viking marriage shows its teeth. Tonight, we're heading into the realm of social shame and blood justice, where breaking the sacred codes of marriage could get you shamed, exiled, or very, very dead. Let's start with the concept of honour. It wasn't just personal pride or a shiny word people said before duelling. In Viking society, honour was social currency, legal standing, and family reputation all rolled into one. You could be the strongest warrior in the region, but if your marriage was the talk of the village for all the wrong reasons, if your wife had a lover, if your husband was found sneaking off to another farmstead, or if your spouse made you look weak in public, your honour took a direct hit. And when that happened, people didn't just gossip, they acted. One of the most severe responses to a marriage, betrayal, was the honour killing. No, not every affair ended with a murder. Vikings were practical. But if an affair brought shame on a high-status family, especially if it became public, the response was often violent. A husband might kill his wife's lover, a brother might kill a brother-in-law. Sometimes both the adulterous parties were executed, usually with a poetic flourish, thrown into a fjord, hung from a tree, or beheaded in front of their families. This wasn't just revenge, it was reputation management. But the real nightmare, that came when the affair sparked a feud. Let's say your daughter's husband is found in bed with a servant. Her brothers retaliate by burning his storehouse. His cousins show up to challenge them at the thing, the local assembly. Someone gets stabbed. Blood has been spilled. Now it's a family affair, and not the fun kind. Viking feuds could stretch across generations, with marriage betrayals often acting as the spark. A single night of bad judgment might cost you 5 years of peace, a nephew, and a barn. Social shame wasn't just reserved for the guilty parties either. The entire household suffered. If a wife was found to be unfaithful, her children might be mocked or excluded from inheritance. If a husband beat his wife too cruelly or publicly, his neighbours might stop trading with him, fearing his instability. Honour was collective. Your private choices had public consequences, and the village never forgot, especially the old women who sat near the fire and remembered everything. Here's a fringe fact that shows how deep this ran. In some regions, people accused of marital betrayal could be subjected to a ritual humiliation known as skaldic exposure. A poet, usually one who'd been paid or personally offended, would compose a verse about the scandal and recite it publicly, often at feasts. These poems, once spoken, were almost impossible to recover from. They were brutal, clever, and devastating. And worse, they were memorable. If someone mocked your spouse's infidelity in a poem, that line might follow you for generations. In Viking culture, physical wounds healed, but reputation, that stuck like burrs in wool. And what about accusations that weren't true? That's where things got tricky. If someone accused your spouse of adultery without evidence, you could challenge them to a duel, yes, an actual weapon-wielding, possibly lethal duel, to defend their name. Some people died protecting someone who hadn't even been faithful to begin with. But honour demanded a response. Silence was complicity. For women, the stakes were even higher. A man caught in an affair might suffer shame, but he could still reclaim his place if he fought well, paid fines, or married strategically. A woman, on the other hand, could be permanently ruined. If divorced for infidelity, she might never remarry. If her own family disowned her, she could be cast out, living as a servant or even a beggar. Some women, once shamed, turned to cedar, the outlawed sorcery of the shadows, because if you're going to be branded unworthy, you might as well embrace the power that comes with fear. That said, Viking society wasn't monolithic. In some cases, especially in more isolated settlements or among lower status families, breaches of marriage were dealt with quietly. A husband might exile his wife's lover rather than kill him. A wife might endure her husband's wandering eye as long as it didn't threaten her children's inheritance. Some scandals were swept under the fur rug, dealt with through whispered negotiations, bribes, or a hasty wedding to cover up an inconvenient pregnancy. Vikings weren't above damage control. They just preferred it with a side of mead and plausible deniability. Now let's talk about symbolic punishments. Not every betrayal ended in blood. Sometimes it ended in mockery. A husband might throw his wife's belongings into the yard for all to see, her spindle, her combs, her clothes, signalling her shame. A wife might break her husband's cup or publicly return his sword, a gesture that essentially screamed, "I'm done," and everyone should know why. These acts were part theatre, part message, part catharsis. They were how you announced the end of trust without necessarily ending a life. Scholars still debate how often these extreme reactions happened. Some argue that sagas exaggerated the drama, turning every marital mishap into a murder. Others believe the threats of violence were enough to enforce conformity, like a social scarecrow. Either way, the fear of shame was real, and it shaped behaviour more effectively than any written law. Even children weren't immune. If born out of wedlock or amid scandal, they might be denied rights, inheritance, or even a name. Some were quietly fostered out, raised by relatives or given to others to raise far from the sight of their parents' disgrace. In one saga, a child born from an adulterous union grows up never knowing his true parentage, until a war breaks out over his right to inherit a field no one even wanted until it came with honour attached. And here's something to chew on. In Viking law, lying about someone's marriage could also be punished. If you accused a woman of infidelity falsely, you could be fined or outlawed, because in a society where reputation was everything, lies were just as deadly as truth. So, if you're a Viking wife keeping the household together, watching the servants, monitoring your husband's late-night walks, making sure your cousin's daughter doesn't sneak off with the neighbour's thrall, you live in a constant state of quiet vigilance. You know that one misstep, one rumour, one jealous whisper could bring it all crashing down. And once the shame begins, it spreads, like frost creeping across the walls at night. But maybe you hold the line. Maybe you outlast the gossip, prove your loyalty, or strike first before the scandal can bloom. Because in Viking marriage, the greatest threat isn't always betrayal. Sometimes it's the silence after, the judgment, the way the longhouse goes quiet when you enter, the way no one looks you in the eye, and so you live carefully, sharply. You keep your honour like a blade, always sharp, always visible, and never left unattended. Let's walk away from the longhouse tonight, away from the feast tables, the firelight, the gossip and ghosts, and the never-ending clatter of children and swords. Let's go somewhere quieter, into the hills maybe, or deep into the pine woods, where the wind hums low and the sky opens wide. Because sometimes, even in a society that measured marriage by honour, inheritance and cattle, people needed an escape, a break, a breath, a moment alone. And for some Viking women and men, that meant retreating from marriage entirely. Whether by choice or by exile, some stepped outside the system. And what they found there? Well, it was strange, fierce, and sometimes strangely free. We don't talk enough about single life in Viking society. Not single like waiting for Mr. Right, but single like I'm out, done. A widow, a divorcee, a spinster, a bachelor with no clan obligations, no in-laws to appease, no annual goat feast pressure. People like that existed, and not always on the margins. In fact, in a world where marriage was practically a business arrangement, opting out gave you a kind of twisted freedom, especially if you had something the world wanted, like land, a respected name, or a suspiciously sharp mind. Take widows, for example. After their husbands died, women in Viking society didn't just slip into black and fade into obscurity. They inherited, they led, they made decisions about their children's futures, managed the household on their own, and sometimes, brace yourself, didn't remarry. That wasn't always because they were heartbroken. Sometimes it was strategic. A widow could retain control over property, avoid transferring her wealth to a new husband, and still maintain her place in society. A clever widow knew that power came not just from alliances, but from the ability to choose when and if to make them. And divorced women? They were rare, but not unknown. Viking law allowed both men and women to initiate divorce, and if the woman had a strong family or solid reputation, she could bounce back just fine. No scarlet letter, no exile. Maybe a few judgmental side eyes at the market, but if she played her cards right, she could remarry, or choose not to. Some became landowners, traders, guardians of fostered children, keepers of the household's oral history, not wives, not mothers, just women, holding space in a culture that didn't always know what to do with them. Now let's get weirder, because not everyone who stepped away from marriage did it politely. Some were outcasts, exiled for scandal, accused of witchcraft, caught in the wrong feud at the wrong time. These people lived on the edges, both geographically and socially. They might set up a hut in the forest, build a turf-roofed shelter near a fjord, or join a band of mercenaries who had no time for domestic drama. Some of these outcasts were women, and some of them, they flourished. The sagas whisper about women who never married, who lived alone or with other women, who were skilled in healing, farming, storytelling, or cedar. Were they witches? Maybe. Were they simply free? Possibly. We'll never know for sure because the sagas are written through a lens of cultural suspicion. But the fact that they appear at all, that people remembered them, feared them, sometimes respected them, tells us that Viking marriage wasn't the only path to significance, just the loudest one. There's even a term in Old Norse for an unmarried woman of independent means, kona. It means woman, yes, but it often implied a woman of status, experience, and autonomy. She might have once been married, she might not. What mattered was her presence, her ability to navigate the world without needing a man at her side. And while men might grumble about such women, they also listened when they spoke, because they'd survived more winters than most warriors, and knew how to make stew from near nothing. On the male side, things were trickier. A bachelor with no land or alliances was often pitied, mocked, or pressured to marry. But not all men played along. Some joined raiding crews and never returned. Others became wandering poets, mercenaries, or priests once Christianity crept in. There are references in later texts to monk-like men who lived apart, choosing study or solitude over domestic life. Were they lonely? Some, maybe. But others might have preferred the cold honesty of isolation to the hot mess of marriage politics. One fringe fact that lights up the scholars' debates: in certain graves, archaeologists have found evidence of what appear to be small self-sufficient households, just 2 or 3 people, living together, buried together, without any obvious kinship markers. Were they lovers? Outcast friends? Secret families? We don't know, but they hint at alternative living arrangements that didn't fit the clan-centred model we usually picture. And what about the emotional side? Could people actually be happy outside marriage in a culture that prized it so heavily? The sagas surprisingly say yes. There are characters who, after a failed marriage or the death of a spouse, choose solitude over remarriage, not because they gave up, but because they understood themselves. They found peace in simplicity, in silence, in being left alone. Imagine that, a Viking woman sitting at her loom, weaving her own life line by line, not for a husband, not for a child, but for herself. Now, of course, there were downsides. Single people were more vulnerable to legal challenges, they had fewer allies in feuds, and without children they risked being forgotten, their names uncarved in stone. But some didn't care. They wrote their legacy in other ways, through poetry, healing, fierce independence, or sheer survival. In a world where death was always a frostbite away, choosing how to live, even quietly, was a kind of rebellion. Here's a favourite example. Unn the Deep-Minded. A matriarch from the Laxdæla saga, she outlived her husband, sailed to Iceland with a fleet of followers, claimed land, and ruled her clan without ever remarrying. She's not described as lonely, she's described as powerful. When she died, she was given a burial mound fit for a chieftain. No husband, no scandal, no apology. And maybe that's the quiet truth beneath all the chaos we've explored. That even in a society obsessed with marriage, where your name was tied to someone else's, your value often measured in sheep and sons, there was still room to step away, to define yourself by your own firelight, to claim space without sharing it. So tonight, if you're imagining yourself not at the centre of the feast but outside it, in the quiet dark, hands wrapped around a warm bowl of broth, a wolf howling in the distance and no one asking when you'll settle down, know this. In the Viking world there was always a place for the ones who didn't fit. Maybe not in the poems, but in the echoes between them. Now let's slip beneath the surface, into the icy, surging current that carried Viking culture far from home. Trade, travel, and the long, oar-bent journeys that made and broke marriages across the Norse world. Because while Viking love stories are usually told against the backdrop of smoky hearths and local feuds, the reality is that many of these relationships were forged or fractured over miles of open sea. Whether your husband left every spring to raid, or your wife packed up and vanished with her caravan to Dublin, travel didn't just complicate Viking marriage. Sometimes it rewrote it entirely. You already know the basics. Viking men sailed. They were raiders, traders, explorers, sometimes mercenaries. From Iceland to Constantinople, from the Baltic to Baghdad, they followed silver and glory like moths to flame. A man might leave in early spring and not return for years, or ever, and in the meantime, his wife held the farm, raised the children, settled disputes, paid taxes, and prayed he wasn't bleeding into a swamp somewhere on the Frankish coast. For her, marriage meant managing an entire estate alone most of the time, with the added bonus of not knowing whether she was still technically married. Some wives had it down to a rhythm. They knew what to expect, they had backup plans. They kept extra grain in storage and hidden knives in the rafters. Others fell apart, crushed by uncertainty, bad harvests, or the creeping suspicion that their husbands weren't just trading for spices in Miklagard, but enjoying a side dish of southern mistresses and wine-soaked poetry. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Viking men didn't always stay faithful abroad. Far from it. In trading towns like Hedeby and Novgorod, there were entire districts where foreign women, captives, servants, or local vendors entered into temporary relationships with Viking men. Some were consensual, some were not. Some resulted in children who never knew their father's name. To the men, these affairs were often seen as practical, a comfort, a break from the duties of home. But to the wives back in the fjords, betrayal, confusion, or in some cases denial. It went both ways, of course. With their husbands gone for months or years, some Viking women took lovers, quietly, carefully, sometimes with the full knowledge of their in-laws. The sagas are full of hints. The child born a year too early, the glance between neighbours that lasts a beat too long. One tale tells of a woman who kept a lover hidden in the barn for 2 full winters while her husband raided in Ireland. Did the husband find out? Number, did the community know? Oh, absolutely. But no one said a word, until the lover got drunk and bragged at a feast. Then came the knives. But let's shift gears. Travel didn't just strain marriages, it created them. Many Viking unions began across borders, across languages. Men met women in foreign ports and struck deals with their families. Some took brides from conquered villages, willingly or not. Others married for access to trade routes, local influence, or simply because love showed up in the form of a Germanic merchant's daughter who knew how to swear in 3 languages and drink anyone under the table. These cross-cultural marriages were surprisingly common. We have records of Norsemen marrying Slavic women, Irish noblewomen, even Byzantine courtiers. These unions weren't always about power. Sometimes they were just the result of proximity. You spend 3 winters in Novgorod trading furs and drinking too much honey mead, you might end up falling for the innkeeper's daughter who keeps bringing you hot soup and fixing your boots. One thing leads to another. Boom! International marriage. And what about the women who travelled? We rarely talk about them, but they existed. Some accompanied their husbands on expeditions. Others went as traders in their own right, managing goods, sailing inland rivers, or running market stalls in foreign towns. A few became political hostages, married off to foreign leaders to seal a treaty. And some simply left, ran away, started over in new lands where no one knew their clan, their story, or their past. There's evidence that Norse women settled in areas like the Danelaw and assimilated quickly, sometimes marrying into local communities and never returning home. One fringe fact: there's a runestone in Sweden that memorialises a woman named Thorgunna who died far from home, possibly in present-day Ukraine. Her epitaph reads simply, "She was wise, she was brave." No mention of a husband, just that, a woman who travelled, died abroad, and left behind a memory strong enough to carve into stone. But these mobile marriages weren't without complications. Communication was nearly impossible. A man who left home might send messages with travellers, short notes, carved onto sticks or thin sheets of metal. Most never arrived. So families waited, hoped, listened for rumours. Some even consulted seers, asking whether their loved one was still alive or whether the ocean had taken him. If the answer was gone, the marriage was over. The widow could remarry. If the answer was still alive but years had passed, she waited, or didn't. Scholars still debate what happened when a man returned to find his wife remarried. Some laws allowed her to keep the new husband. Others required a legal choice. It got messy. There are sagas about men coming home only to find their wives in new households, with children, obligations, and no intention of resuming the past. Some men accepted it. Others killed everyone in sight. Viking reunions were rarely tidy affairs, and children born from these far-flung unions, they complicated everything. A man might come home with a child from a foreign mistress and expect his wife to raise it. Or he might die abroad, leaving behind a widow and a child the home family never even knew about. In some cases, these children later travelled to claim inheritance, sparking lawsuits, feuds, and awkward feasting invitations. Bloodlines mattered, but memory mattered more. If no one knew who you were, even a full Norse pedigree wouldn't save you. Still, travel expanded the Viking world. It made the marriage map bigger, stranger, more unpredictable. And for some, that meant freedom. A chance to fall in love not with the person your father picked, but with someone who saw you across a crowded market and offered you an apple and a knife in the same breath. A chance to escape a bad marriage by sailing away. A chance to start fresh, even if the sails were patched and the horizon uncertain. So picture this. You're standing at the dock. Your husband's ship is a black line against the morning sun. Maybe he's off to trade. Maybe he's raiding. Maybe he won't come back. Or maybe you won't wait. Maybe you're the one stepping onto the boat this time. No veil, no promises. Just wind, water, and the possibility of something else. Because in Viking marriage, the ocean was both a threat and a promise. It took as much as it gave, but it always changed everything. By now, you know Viking marriage wasn't all longhouse snuggles and handfasting under the aurora. It was complicated, political, brutal when it needed to be. But what about the endgame? Not death, not divorce, but what came after? After decades of shared winters, after the children were grown, after the swords dulled and the gossip quieted, tonight we're curling up with something surprisingly gentle, the slow evolution of a marriage that lasted, the long-haul love stories, the quiet partnerships, the kind of marriages that managed, against all odds, to become something steady, respectful, even tender. Let's be clear, Viking society wasn't built to celebrate romantic longevity. You didn't get a golden brooch for surviving 40 years of joint property management. There weren't songs written about the couple who spent their evenings quietly shelling beans together or arguing about whose turn it was to feed the pigs. But these marriages happened. They weren't dramatic. That was the point. At the core of these enduring marriages was partnership. Not fairy tale passion or breathless vows, but a practical, steady give and take. The man protected the family. The woman ran the household. And after a while, those roles softened into each other. She knew how to patch a shield. He learned when to keep his voice down. They stopped needing words to understand when it was time to send a servant away, or when a neighbour's joke had gone just a little too far. This was survival-based affection. Not flashy, but real. Elderly Viking couples pop up in the sagas from time to time, though rarely as main characters. They're the background figures, offering advice, mediating disputes, telling younger warriors to sit down and stop acting like they invented fire. Sometimes they're mocked. Too old to lift a sword, the younger men say, but that same old man might still remember every debt ever owed to the family. And the old woman? She probably knows which rune to carve to keep the hearthfire burning through a bad storm. One particularly lovely example shows up in the Fatensdale saga, where an older couple named Ingimund and Vigdis quietly run their estate together in northern Iceland. After a lifetime of hardship, including feuds, failed alliances, and the deaths of children, they settle into a kind of mutual respect. Vigdis manages the household with ruthless competence, while Ingimund acts as a chieftain. When trouble arrives, they don't scream or panic. They exchange glances. They strategize. You get the sense that they've been through worse, and that despite the griefs they've weathered, they still trust each other deeply. Here's a fringe fact that speaks volumes. In some Viking graves, elderly couples were buried side by side. Not always, but often enough to suggest it meant something. Some of these dual burials show signs of joint planning, similar grave goods, mirrored positions, matching inscriptions. In one case from Denmark, an older couple was buried holding hands. No one knows their names. No saga tells their story. But the archaeologists couldn't ignore the detail. It was small, human, and it stuck. And what about affection? Did Viking couples show it? Especially after the fire had cooled and the children had moved on. Not always publicly. Norse culture prized restraint, especially among the older generation. But there are hints. A husband might carve a runestone in his wife's memory, calling her wise or the joy of the hall. A woman might commission a brooch for her aging husband with protective runes, saying in her own quiet way, "I want you to come home safe. Again." These gestures weren't loud, but they were lasting. There's also the domestic rhythm to consider. After decades together, Viking couples moved in sync. She could manage the household while he was away without needing instruction. He could interpret a single raised eyebrow across a feast table and know whether to speak, stay silent, or draw his knife. Their partnership was forged in repetition, season after season of shared tasks, shared space, shared choices. Love didn't always look like a sonnet. Sometimes it looked like knowing how the other takes their broth. Now let's talk about the most Viking thing of all, death. When one partner died, especially after a long life together, the surviving spouse often took on a new role. For widowers, it meant managing alone or passing responsibilities to a son. Some remarried quickly, others did not. The sagas rarely show men grieving, but once in a while, a story slips through. A man who builds a cairn for his wife and visits it daily. A father who never remarries after his wife dies, though encouraged to. His reason. No one else could share my thoughts. For widows, the power shift was even more noticeable. A woman who had survived her husband often gained more freedom, more control. She could represent her household in legal matters, oversee grandchildren, and, if she wished, arrange marriages for others. Some became matriarchs, feared and respected in equal measure. But behind that authority there was often a quiet grief, not loud, not weeping, just the empty seat by the hearth, the silent knowledge of shared memories no one else could understand. Sometimes these older marriages were challenged by the next generation. A son marrying a woman with strong opinions, a daughter pushing to manage the estate differently, and the old couple would hold the line, together, until it was time to let go. They weren't always sentimental, but they were stubborn, and that stubbornness, it wasn't just pride, it was earned wisdom, held together by years of shared survival. Now for a bit of open scholarly debate. Were these long-term marriages the exception or the norm? Some historians argue that most Viking marriages were short-lived, cut down by war, disease or divorce. Others suggest that quiet, enduring unions were common, just not interesting enough to make the sagas. After all, who wants to hear about two people peacefully managing a sheep farm for 30 years when you could read about a love triangle ending in beheadings and blood eagles? Still, even in the most dramatic tales, there are moments, small, quiet moments, where love breaks through the noise. A man bringing his wife a flower he picked while hunting. A woman standing silently at her husband's side when everyone else has, turned against him. These flashes suggest something deeper beneath the saga bluster, something solid. So tonight, picture this. The hearth is low, the children are grown, and the longhouse is quiet in that rare way you've earned. Your spouse sits across from you, their face lined, their hands calloused, their mind still sharp. You fought, loved, endured, buried, laughed. You've built a world together out of wood and wool, sweat and silence. There are no witnesses now, no gods to impress, no clan to appease, just the two of you sharing a bowl of warm soup and an old story you've both heard 100 times. And in that moment, maybe Viking marriage isn't brutal. Maybe it's just real, messy, flawed, enduring, like the sea, like fire, like love carved not into runes but into the quiet daily choices that hold a life together. You've heard the weddings, you've sat through the scandals, watched the feuds unfold, maybe even whispered to yourself, "Wow, Viking marriage sounds like a never-ending reality show, but with more knives." But there's one more layer we haven't peeled back yet, one that's harder to see, but absolutely everywhere once you start looking. The inheritance battles, the property chessboard, the legacy building that started the moment a couple said yes, and didn't stop until long after they were buried side by side, or thrown into different hills altogether. Tonight, we crack open the cold, calculating side of Viking love, the fight for what's left behind. See, Viking marriage wasn't just about living together, it was about dying together, or at least planning for what would happen after. The moment a marriage was made, so too was the long-term legal mess that would come with it. Land, livestock, ships, rings, that one dagger with your grandfather's name on it that nobody's allowed to touch, and most important of all, the children, the heirs, the ones who'd carry your name and your debts, through the next generation of ice and fire. Let's start with the inheritance laws. Viking legal tradition gave certain rights to both men and women, but it was complicated. Sons inherited most of the land and major wealth, especially if they were born within a legitimate marriage. Daughters also had rights, especially in the early period, but their inheritance was often tied up in dowries, which were supposed to go with them when they married. And if a daughter died before marriage, sometimes her share went to her brothers, sometimes to her mother, sometimes it vanished into legal limbo while everyone pretended it never existed. And what about illegitimate children? Oh, the drama. If a man acknowledged a child born outside marriage, that child could inherit, though usually less than a legitimate heir. If he didn't acknowledge the child, good luck. In some cases, mothers had to fight tooth and nail to get their children recognised. In others, they made secret deals with the man's family, offering silence in exchange for support. And sometimes the child grew up knowing they were part of the family, but never of it. Always one step outside the warm circle, always trying to prove their worth. Things got especially dicey when a father died unexpectedly. If the will wasn't clear, or if there wasn't one, relatives came crawling out of the fjord like damp, grudge-holding ghosts. Cousins claimed land they hadn't seen in decades. Half-brothers turned up with witnesses who could confirm promises supposedly made years ago. And women. Whether daughters or widows, they were expected to be polite, patient, and not too loud while their rights were quietly auctioned off behind their backs. But here's the thing, some women fought back. Hard. Take the case of Aud the Deep-Minded. Yes, again. After her son died, she took over his estate and personally led a group of settlers to Iceland, distributing land on her terms. She didn't wait for a council of men to decide if she was worthy. She didn't remarry to secure her position. She claimed power. And even centuries later, her story stood as proof that Viking women weren't always just silent players in the inheritance game. Some were the ones writing the rules. Another clever tactic? The gift on the deathbed move. Sometimes a dying husband would bypass traditional inheritance structures by giving key possessions directly to a trusted heir. Often a favoured child, a niece, even a godchild. These gifts couldn't always be contested, especially if there were witnesses, which meant that if you were smart, kind, and happened to be nearby when an elder started coughing ominously, you might walk away with a very nice boat. And don't forget the dowry boomerang. If a wife died, her dowry was supposed to return to her birth family, unless there were surviving children. In that case, the husband could keep it, using it to support their shared heirs. But families argued over this constantly. Some claimed the dowry should go back anyway. Others insisted the wife had promised it would stay. There are records of brothers storming into estates years later, demanding their sister's silk cloak or ceremonial combs, not because they needed them, but because they mattered. Here's a fringe fact that most saga readers miss. Some inheritance disputes were settled by poetry. Yes, poetry. If a claimant could compose a verse proving their right to a specific item, often including family lineage, shared memories, or divine signs, they might win over public opinion at the local thing. Was it legally binding? Not always. But in a world where reputation shaped reality, a powerful poem could tip the scales. And then there's the issue of burial rights. Who got to be buried where mattered almost as much as who got the cows. In Viking tradition, family burial grounds were sacred spaces, markers of identity, belonging, and honour. If a wife was denied burial near her husband, it was a statement, a punishment, a declaration that her marriage hadn't been true, her role hadn't been respected. Some widows fought for burial axes more fiercely than they had for property. To be buried beside the one you lived with wasn't just romantic. It was legal proof that you belonged. But burial could also be used politically. If two feuding families had finally reconciled through marriage, burying the couple together became a peace offering. And if a feud reignited later, there are rumours, unconfirmed but delicious, that some angry relatives moved the bones, quietly, just to make a point. Let's not forget the children in all of this. Viking heirs were expected to earn their inheritance. A lazy son could be passed over in favour of a hard-working nephew. A daughter who married poorly might lose her claim, and some parents intentionally divided their property unevenly, not to punish, but to protect, giving more to the child who lived nearby, less to the one who'd married into another clan. It wasn't always fair, but it was always calculated. And if someone died without heirs, all bets were off. Local chieftains might swoop in, the crown might claim it, or neighbours might divvy it up like crows around a fallen ox. But in some cases, a loyal servant or foster child was granted ownership, a rare but beautiful gesture that shows Viking legacy wasn't just about blood. Sometimes it was about loyalty, sometimes love. Scholars still debate how rigid these systems were. Some say Viking inheritance followed strict rules. Others argue that negotiation and influence mattered more than law. Probably both are true. Like everything in Norse society, it was a dance between tradition and opportunity, between what you were owed and what you could grab before someone else did. So now, imagine this. You're old. Your hands are calloused, your hair is silver, your longhouse still stands, you've buried a spouse, maybe two. Your children sit at your table, loud and sharp and ambitious. You know the feuds they've inherited, the grudges they carry, the secrets you never wrote down. You lay out your possessions, jewellery, landmarkers, hunting knives, and wonder who will carry your name with pride, who will forget you, who will remember your marriage not for how it started, but for what it left behind. Because in the end, Viking love doesn't just live in poems or runes, it lives in what you pass down, and how you're remembered. So what happens when the whole system starts to shift? Not just a single marriage, not just one scandal, but the entire foundation beneath Viking love, partnership, and power. Because by the late Viking Age, things are changing. The gods are quieter, the priests louder. Crosses are replacing hammers on pendants. Tonight, we're stepping into the slow-motion collision between Norse tradition and Christianity, and watching Viking marriage get caught right in the crossfire. Now, let's be clear, the Christianization of Scandinavia didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a single mass baptism where everyone shrugged, tossed Thor's hammer in the fjord and decided to try monogamy and church picnics. It was centuries of overlap, contradiction, and uneasy compromise. And one of the biggest points of friction, marriage. Traditional Norse marriage was a flexible, locally governed affair. It emphasized social contracts, property exchange, and clan alliances. Morality? Optional. You could take a concubine, sleep with a thrall, divorce your wife if she mocked your beard too loudly at dinner. Sure, there were expectations, but they were community expectations. The gods didn't micromanage. The thing, assembly, did. Christianity brought an entirely different framework. Marriage wasn't just a legal bond, it was a sacrament, a divine covenant. One man, one woman, until death or plague do you part. No concubines, no polyamorous situationships justified by cattle counts. No ditching your spouse just because she couldn't produce a son or talked too much during raids. And definitely no divorcing your wife by declaring it in front of your neighbours 3 times while throwing her socks out the door. At first this caused serious confusion. Imagine a Viking chieftain who's been married 3 times, has a concubine or 2 on the side, and suddenly gets baptised. Is he now required to pick just one wife? Are the others invalid? Is the priest going to confiscate his thralls? Suddenly the marriage that was perfectly legal and respectable last year is now sinful, illegal, or downright embarrassing, depending on how pious your new bishop is. But the cultural shift wasn't just about rules, it was about control. In Norse society, marriages were managed by families, negotiated, flexible. Christianity brought in church authority. Priests needed to approve the union. Marriages had to be conducted in front of God. Consent was emphasized, not just of the families, but of the individuals. Radical, right? Especially in a world where women were often married off as political pawns before they could pronounce their husband's name without tripping over it. To the younger generation, especially those raised under both traditions, this duality was both frustrating and freeing. On one hand, Christianity added pressure, more rules, more judgment, more expectation of sexual purity, but on the other hand, it protected some people, especially women. Under church law, a woman could no longer be married off against her will, at least in theory. She had a voice in the matter, and in some cases the church backed her up. That was a shift with real consequences. There are stories, rare but real, of women appealing to bishops to escape abusive marriages. Others used the new Christian framework to avoid remarriage after widowhood, claiming they wanted to devote their lives to God. Translation: I'd rather raise goats alone in peace than marry that guy with the comb-over and temper problem. And guess what? The church often agreed. Christianity also complicated inheritance. The old Norse rules about dowry and bride price didn't fit neatly into Christian property laws. Suddenly land passed through male primogeniture, not clan negotiation. Widows sometimes lost property they would have kept under the old system. Daughters, once active agents in marriage contracts, found themselves sidelined. Power was consolidating, not just in the hands of men but in the hands of the church. And let's not pretend the transition was peaceful. In many places, people practiced both systems for generations. A man might get baptized on Sunday, then sacrifice a goat to Thor on Monday because, just in case. A couple might have a Christian wedding for appearances, then hold a private ceremony under the old gods in a grove where their grandparents once pledged themselves. Dual weddings weren't uncommon. One for the law, one for the truth. One fringe fact. In the early Christian period, some Norse couples buried Thor's hammer pendants alongside crosses, as if they weren't choosing between old and new but trying to cover all their bases. Even in death, Viking marriage remained practical. The sagas written during and after Christianization often reflect this tension. Some demonize old traditions, others romanticize them. One Icelandic tale even features a priest who secretly respects the old ways, performing marriages that blend both styles. He blesses the union in God's name, but also whispers Freya's name over the bride's hair. It's fiction, but the kind that suggests a deeper truth. Change doesn't erase culture, it just forces it to adapt. By the 12th century, Norse marriage looked very different. Public concubinage was taboo, divorce was harder to obtain, priests oversaw weddings, and Christianity was no longer a foreign idea, it was the default. But the echoes of old love customs never fully vanished. Women still wove protective runes into their husbands' cloaks. Men still carved messages into combs and jewellery. And in remote areas, people whispered old wedding songs, tweaked to sound like hymns, but carrying the cadence of ancient vows. One open scholarly debate centres on whether Christian marriage actually improved conditions for Viking women. Some argue yes. It gave them legal protections, enforced mutual consent, and curtailed some of the more exploitative customs. Others say no. It stripped them of property rights, redefined their roles as passive, and placed more power in the hands of male clergy. The truth, predictably, is somewhere in between. Gains and losses, new freedoms, new cages. But for couples caught in the middle, it was chaos. Imagine being newlyweds in a transitional village. Do you follow the bishop's advice, your grandmother's? Do you raise your kids to pray or to chant? What's the right way to love someone when the very definition of marriage is shifting under your feet? Some couples thrived, they adapted, they found strength in faith or simply in each other. Others faltered. Old expectations clashed with new obligations. A man raised to expect obedience suddenly married to a Christian wife who quotes scripture about equality. A woman raised to manage a household told to submit to her husband's will. Not exactly a smooth adjustment. And yet, the heart of Viking marriage survived. The resilience, the negotiation, the quiet understanding that love in this world had to be practical and passionate, patient and protective. That didn't vanish with the gods, it just changed clothes. So now picture yourself standing in a half-Christian, half-heathen hall, your marriage blessed by both priest and elder, your spouse beside you, unsure but willing. You hold a hammer pendant in one hand, a cross in the other. You've just exchanged vows, some ancient, some new, and the wind outside carries the old gods' names, even as the bell tolls from the new church up the hill. And for a moment, you understand something your ancestors never had to. That love, real love, isn't just about keeping the old ways or embracing the new. It's about weathering the storm between them, together. Now it's time to look into the mirror. Not the polished kind you might find hanging from a Viking woman's belt, catching just enough morning light to reflect her cheekbones and frown lines, but the deep wavy kind. The kind that shows not just your face, but your place in the world. Because if you've made it this far, through the weddings, the wars, the drama, the dogs chewing bones under the longhouse table while people quietly plot each other's downfalls, you've probably wondered, what does all of this say about you? Let's take a breath and ask the biggest, messiest question of all. Was Viking marriage worth it? If you were a woman, the stakes were colossal. Marriage could mean safety, wealth, children, reputation, power. But it could also mean servitude, silence, being reduced to your womb and your weaving. You had to be clever, politically aware, resilient. You had to know how to run a farm in winter, fend off a drunk cousin with a sword, interpret your husband's silences, and raise children who might not even be yours, all while maintaining your reputation and not cursing your in-laws too publicly. And yet, women found ways to thrive. They learned to maneuver the system. Some became matriarchs, landowners, respected counsellors. Others wrote their own fate, walking away from bad marriages, taking lovers, refusing to remarry. Some found genuine affection in their partners. A few even found love. Not the soft, honey-sweet kind of later fairy tales, but the fire-forged, frost-bitten, earned kind. The kind that comes from surviving a decade of famine and still finding time to laugh over burned stew. If you were a man, marriage was an anchor, or a leash, depending on your situation. It gave you legitimacy, heirs, seat at the table. But it also came with expectations: provide, protect, control, defend, negotiate, dominate. You were judged by how your wife behaved, how your children thrived, how your household functioned. A poor marriage could break your honour. A smart, capable wife could make you a legend, just as a concubine could turn your story into a footnote. And if you were outside the marriage system altogether, an exile, a widow, a child born to a forgotten affair, you still felt its pull. Marriage shaped inheritance, loyalty, and place. Even those who stepped outside the system couldn't ignore its influence. Love didn't exist in a vacuum. It was tied to land, to law, to memory. But, and here's where things get interesting, Viking marriage wasn't frozen in time. It evolved, flexed, adapted. It wasn't one thing. It was hundreds. The hard, pragmatic marriages negotiated on storm-beaten coastlines. The quiet, enduring ones forged over decades. The doomed unions that led to feuds and poems. The secret affairs. The one-sided loves. The strategic matches that turned into something warmer than anyone expected. All of them existed. All of them mattered. There's a strange beauty in that, because it means Viking marriage wasn't just about rules or roles. It was about how people made meaning inside those constraints, how they navigated grief, passion, power, betrayal, survival, how they kept trying, even when the gods fell silent and the priests wouldn't shut up. Take the sagas. On the surface, they're about heroes and battles. But dig deeper, and they're stories about relationships, about loyalty and betrayal, about the quiet strength of mothers, the stubbornness of fathers, the cleverness of daughters, the ambition of sons. Marriage sits at the core of these tales, not because it's romantic, but because it's real, because it's the structure that holds up the roof of the story. And what about you, sitting in your bed, maybe in a city 1,000 years removed from the Longhouse, listening to this by lamplight or headphones, wondering what any of this has to do with you? Here's the answer: everything. Because Viking marriage, for all its brutality and baggage, is just another version of the human condition. We still struggle with loyalty and freedom. We still navigate expectations, partnership, identity. We still ask whether love can survive hardship, or if it's just a thing we tell ourselves to make survival sweeter. You might not need to trade 6 cows and a drinking horn to propose marriage, but you've probably had a relationship that felt like a battlefield. Maybe you've played peacemaker in your family. Maybe you've sat across from someone you once loved and realised it wasn't enough anymore. Or maybe, just maybe, you found someone who walks beside you the way old Norse couples did. Not always smiling, not always singing, but there. Solid, steady. Holding the gate closed when the wind kicks up. We inherit more from the Vikings than stories of war and conquest. We inherit their relationships, the messy, often contradictory attempts to build lives with other people in a harsh, unpredictable world. That's the real legacy. Not the swords, not the ships. But the quiet fact that they loved, lost, betrayed, forgave, and started again. So here's your final image. 2 people sitting by a hearth at the end of a long day. Maybe there's stew bubbling, maybe someone's mending a tunic. They're older now. They've survived raids and winters, births and deaths. There's no feast, no music, just the crackle of the fire and the way their hands brush when one passes the other a cup. Nothing flashy, just a lifetime. And that's the kind of Viking marriage no saga needed to write down, because the people living it already knew it was enough. So now you're lying there, maybe half tucked in, Maybe blinking slow at the ceiling while your brain digests 30,000 words of Viking intensity. Maybe you're wondering what just happened. Maybe you're wondering why it kind of felt like home. Let's wind this down together, quietly, the way a good story should end. No more blood feuds or dowry negotiations, just breath and memory and a flickering sense that somehow, somewhere in all of it, you found a piece of yourself. Because Viking marriage, messy, strategic, layered, and absurdly human, wasn't so different from the way we all stumble into each other now. Sure, you're probably not trading sheep for a partner, hopefully, or managing land disputes while also raising 5 foster kids and praying your husband isn't dead in France. But you know the feeling of compromise, of wondering if loyalty